Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Guy's and St Thomas virtual MPN Voice Patients Forum. This is a very first for us due to the COVID crisis, but we would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you who have joined us before at the patient forums and all our new patients and their friends and families who are joining us for the first time. We wish to thank Guy's and St Thomas's Charitable Trust for making today possible, and also to Brancast Health for their support. So, who is MPN Voice? A lot of you will have seen this slide before, but I'm using it again because there are a lot of new faces who are joining the MPN community. When we started, the charity was started in 2003, led by Claire Harrison, and with a small group of patients, haematologists, specialist nurses, and psychologists. It became MPD Voice in 2011 and MPN Voice in 2013. That was because the World Health Organization reclassified MPNs as neoplasms. There are two pictures there. One is Guy's and one is St Thomas's. They're there because that is where MPN Voice is founded. But since those early days, we have spread around the country and into Europe and indeed around the world. Our community is growing, but we just use those as that is where we started. So what do we do? MPN Voice was started to support people with rare blood cancers. We provide up-to-date information on all aspects of MPN via our website, disease and drug information booklets, lifestyle information leaflets, Facebook, Twitter, and Health Unlocked community dedicated to MPN patients. I would just like to mention one other thing. We have, and Maz has a stock of these, some MPN Voice cards, which on the back you can detail the medication you're on and your hospital that you're treated under, so that in the very unfortunate circumstances of being involved in an accident, a doctor will know whether or not to give you aspirin and what other drugs may not go with your existing medication. If you would like one of these, please contact Maz. We talked about Health Unlocked, and I'd like to just say that MPN Voice joined Health Unlocked in 2012. We currently have 5,690 members, and we've had 7,823 posts. This is growing, which is a huge excitement for us all. What I would say also, it is very closely monitored so that we get the accurate information that we really all need. And anything that is inaccurate is taken down. Twitter and Facebook are also very useful for finding out accurate information. We have to remember MPN Voice was founded on the basis of the need for accurate information. When I was diagnosed in 1991, there were only 12,000 known patients in the country then. It's very different now. With modern blood testing and information, there's a lot more accurate information available. So how do we support people with rare blood cancers? The MPN community supports people through a buddy system, regular patient forums and living with MPN days. But during coronavirus, we have worked very hard to update the website and include information on coping strategies for shielding, including access to podcasts, and we also sent out regular mail shots and social media updates. Webinars with Leukemia Care focusing on MPNs, led by our clinical team. Viewing figures for the videos of each webinar are 3.5K and then a huge 8.8 thousand views. That staggered us, and we were delighted. We have a representative on the Cancer 52 consortium of cancer organisations, regularly joining conference calls and linking with other charities on the evolving situation to ensure that there was an up-to-date flow of consistent information. There have been some surveys, which I'm not going to talk about now because Professor Leslie Anderson will be talking about that, But hopefully you can see that we've been busy during the COVID crisis. The regional forums, it's very sad that we haven't been able to see you all this year, but hopefully next year we will be able to go and join you in the local areas to present updated information to the local teams there and to get some patient feedback. Subject to getting some funding, we are very much hoping that we will hold some virtual forums with the teams from around the UK and Ireland. Illustrating how much the charity has grown over the years, I just look at this particular slide on the Living with MPN's Day in November last year. We had an online audience of 300 and we had 200 people in person in the room. But if we look at the length and breadth of the world that we were getting people attending from, it is absolutely phenomenal. And thanks to everybody who helped make that happen. These are just two examples of some of the research projects that we are currently doing, both of which will be talked about during the course of this morning. Advocacy. This is something that has become a very important aspect of MPN Voice's work. And I'm going to ask John Mathias, our MPN Voice chairperson, to give a small talk about what advocacy does for MPN Voice.
Well, hello everybody. It's a little bit strange, but it's really nice to be able to be talking to you all. I'm just going to give you a very quick update on patient advocacy with MPN Voice. And we'll start off with just a kind of a reminder of what exactly we mean by advocacy. Essentially, it really means just kind of speaking or representing on the behalf of another person or a group. So specifically, patient advocates act as representatives of a patient community, and obviously in our case the MPN patient community. And where do we represent patients? So basically in dialogue, in conversations, in discussions with, for instance, the pharmaceutical industry, with particular pharma companies, with the government, whether that's with organizations like NICE that I'll mention in a minute, or other government organizations, and indeed with other patient groups. So what is our aim? Essentially to make sure that the reality, what it's really like to live with MPNs, to live with that diagnosis, is properly and accurately understood by people who make decisions that affect us. So now this is actually one of the really important reasons that the surveys that you may feel that you've been inundated with, particularly recently, are really, really important, so that the people who are speaking on your behalf, who are representing you, get an accurate and up-to-date picture about what the reality of MPNs really is. As you know, most of us in MPN Voice are patients ourselves. I've been living with ET for over 20 years now. But I don't know what everybody's life is like. I know that I'm actually very lucky, but I know that other people aren't. And that's why it's really important to get a proper picture from you guys about what it's like to live with these diseases. Okay, so in terms of recent activity, so we've been preparing submissions NICE, as I mentioned. If you don't know what NICE is, it's the UK body that's essentially responsible for deciding if drugs or therapies can be made available to the NHS, can be reimbursed by the NHS. And there's a submission which is taking place in early next year, which is for a drug called fedratinib. for myelofibrosis patients, and we've put together a written submission representing MF patients as part of that process, and there'll be a meeting of the NICE committee in January next year, which we will be representing patients at. And along the same lines, we're putting together or preparing to put together a submission for the NCPE, which is the equivalent of NICE in Ireland. And this is for ruxolitinib for polycythemia vera patients in Ireland. And so we're doing that as well. And just lastly, as an example of the work we do with other patient organisations, I wanted to mention a group called Cancer 52, which is a charity that represents patients with less rarer and less common cancers. And as an example of their work, we're a member of Cancer 52. As an example of their work, they've been working over the last 4 or 5 months directly with NHS England to try and explain the impact that coronavirus has been having on patients like us, on cancer patients, and their work has been really important in that sort of representation. So that's just an example of the type of work that we've been doing most recently in patient advocacy. So many of the issues that patients have been kind of concerned with or worried about during the coronavirus crisis have obviously related to the illness itself and to visiting hospital and having checkups, etc. However, we also know that there are a lot of related or other issues that you may be concerned about or you may have questions about. And I just wanted to very briefly flag up Citizens Advice. You may well have, I'm sure you've heard of Citizens Advice and you may well have used them in the past, but they have put together a series of kind of web pages or pointers to other information on their website, which is excellent. And for instance, some of the questions that some people may be concerned with going back to work, whether you have an obligation to go back to work or what your rights are in that situation, or you may be concerned with how benefits that you're entitled to might or might not be affected by the current situation, and other questions like is it possible or how to go about getting insurance of some form or another. So I know that there are a lot of kind of non-medical questions that have arisen over the past few months, and I think Citizens Advice would be a great place to start. But of course, if you wanted to raise any other questions, whatever they might be, then the normal forums that you use for contacting MPN Voice are a good place to go as well.
Thank you, John, for a most informative and useful talk. None of this would be possible without fundraising. MPN Voice actually exists because of the amazing support and contributions by many individual fundraisers. If you would like to organise or take part in a fundraising event, please do get in touch with the fundraising team for advice and support. We literally need every penny that we can raise. We are hoping later this year to update the website, amongst many, many other things. But just a few pictures there show the length and breadth of things people do to raise money for MPN Voice and make it fun. We've just organised a new fundraising team, which is led by both Maz and Marilyn, who used to run the fundraising team, and we're delighted is back with us. But Maz and Marilyn need more volunteer fundraising organisers to join them. Please do feel that it doesn't matter if you've got no experience, but you just have the enthusiasm for MPN Voice. Do please get in contact with them. Just a final thing on fundraising. donations, we really do need your help now. COVID has resulted in us of having far fewer fundraising activities and far more for MPN Voice to do to support the patient community. Following our recent appeal at the beginning of the COVID outbreak, I'm delighted to say £29,000 was raised. It's wonderful, but we do need more. We're needing to continue to raise funds for the studies that we've already spoken about, and we really do need a new website and funds to continue the work that we do. We would be very grateful if you would consider donating to this worthwhile cause, and there is a list of ways that you can donate on the slide here. Thank you all so much for your support. It means so much to so many people, not just here in the UK, but around the world. Thank you. I would now like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Leslie Anderson and to Dr. Lynn Lohelt, who are going to talk to us about the impact of COVID on MPN patients and tell us what we've learned. Welcome.
Hello and welcome. I am Professor Leslie Anderson. I am a Chair in Health Data Science at the University of Aberdeen, and I'm here with my colleague Dr. Lynn Lohelt, who is a lecturer in Global Health at Queen's University Belfast. I have undertaken a lot of research in myeloproliferative neoplasms over the years, trying to understand what causes MPNs. And at the start of the pandemic was particularly interested to understand what impact this had had on patients with MPNs. We started a study with the aim to identify the psychosocial, how people feel about the pandemic, and also understanding the impact that this has had on healthcare and treatment for patients. We advertised the study across a number of platforms, including through charities such as MPN Voice, Blood Cancer UK, Macmillan and Leukemia and Lymphoma NI. We also worked through the MPN Advocates Network in the United States and advertised on a number of Facebook groups and through Facebook advertising. We also tweeted about the study across multiple sites and had radio interviews and press releases in local newspapers in Scotland. The study targeted patients internationally, but particularly within the United Kingdom. Patients were asked to complete a number of different questionnaires looking at characteristics about the patients, such as their gender and their age, and also asked about their quality of life and the impact that the pandemic had had on their quality of life and their MPN symptoms. We used the MPN SAF questionnaire, which many of you might be familiar with from your treatments and also from clinical trials that you may have participated in. And this is a questionnaire that's dedicated particularly to patients with MPNs and asks about a whole array of symptoms. And I'll show you some of the findings in relation to that survey later on. The other thing that we wanted to find out about was around COVID-19. So who had been exposed to COVID-19, who may have suspected that they had had COVID-19, and also what impact this had on their treatments and on their scheduled appointments. In total, we recruited 537 MPN patients by the end of June 2020, although the study is still open. There were 67% of participants were from the UK. The majority were female, and there were a significant portion of people who lived alone, where the pandemic may have had further impacts in relation to isolation. A large majority of the patients were retired, either medically retired or retired through older age. And there were a number of different types of MPN patients who had participated in the survey. The majority of patients had essential thrombocythemia, but we also had 150 patients with polycythemia vera, and we had 69 patients with primary myelofibrosis. About a quarter of patients stated that they were moderately or extremely anxious or depressed at the time of undertaking the study. Apologies. MPN symptoms were recorded by participants. And this graph, which is called a radar plot, shows how common symptoms were, how extreme symptoms were in patients with MPNs. We have patients, and the red line depicts those who participated in this current survey. There are two other lines further in the radar plot, and these show two previous studies, one that was a UK case control study of MPN patients, and one which was an international survey led from America. These two prior studies showed that the symptoms were expressed and experienced very similarly between MPN patients, but the current survey has shown that many of the symptoms experienced by MPN patients are much worse than previously reported. We're seeing particularly that fatigue is a very significant problem, and the further out in the radar chart means the worse the symptom is. So we can see that fatigue, general activity, mood, walking, which is difficult during the pandemic because many participants were screening, and relationships with other peoples, as well as some of the other symptoms such as dizziness, concentration and headaches. And so we identified not only that these symptoms were more common and worse in patients with MPN during the pandemic, but we also identified that quality of life was also lower than general population norms. So that's what we would normally expect to find in people in the general public. We also found that 13% of patients suspected that they had COVID-19. Only one patient reported having had a confirmed diagnosis. About 5% of patients had been in contact with somebody who had tested positive for COVID-19. And in the United Kingdom, about 80% of patients were self-isolating, and at 72% had received a shielding letter. And many of you have received one as well. We had about 2/3 of patients who were going outside for physical activity. This may have been outside in their own home environment. 63% were very or extremely concerned about contracting COVID-19, and 57% said that it had had a negative impact on their health. I'm going to pass over now to my colleague, Dr. Lynn Lofeld, who will present some of the findings from the open text response questions that we had. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. As Leslie mentioned, I'm Lynn Lofeld, and I am here to give you our preliminary analysis, or what we found from the answers people wrote in to the questionnaires or the open-ended questions. And on the screen as well, as Leslie had mentioned, the survey is still ongoing, and so this is the website where people can reach the survey. What we did is something called qualitative content analysis, and that's just a fancy term meaning for each statement that people wrote, we gave it a label or a code, and then we looked at all those labels and clustered them into categories, and finally reduced them even further to, in this case, 2 themes, which I will talk about, and it helps us organize the data because there was a lot of information. So the question that we are focusing on today was, what concerns do you have about the impact of COVID-19 on the care you received as a cancer patient? We found that 115 people decided not to answer that question. So 422 people, which is still a large number, gave an answer. Many of them, though, wrote no concern. So finally we had 284 people who gave 329 answers. Some people gave more than one answer, of course. And the 2 themes, the first is the healthcare system changes due to COVID-19, and the second were COVID-related concerns that individuals had. So for the first theme, we found that over half the answers, people were saying that things related to their health, such as appointments, were less available or they had less access to them. This included regular monitoring of their blood tests, and you can see we have a couple of actual quotes from our participants. One person wrote, will I be able to have my routine blood tests in a few months' time? Some people were concerned that their treatments were not going to be available on schedule, such as delaying venesections, or access to medication, particularly if they were concerned about going to a GP's office or hospital or clinic to get their medication. We also found from the survey where people gave a specific answer or closed answer that almost half of the people reported they had an appointment changed during this COVID-19 pandemic. And this was a third of all the written in answers, so quite a few people wrote about that. Key concerns were there was delay or cancellation of medical appointments. Some of them still don't know when they're going to next see a practitioner. Many of them also commented on how no longer having face-to-face or in-person appointments or difficulties with phones were a concern. People were not as pleased with that because there are certain things that couldn't be done, such as palpation or things that you would need to do in person with your practitioner. And also, one person commented that being deaf, her hearing aids or his were not 100% accurate for clarity of speech. So there was some difficulty for some patients in trying to share or hear about medical information over the phone. A little over 10% reported they were concerned about the lack of information, communication, or knowledge from practitioners or others. It was about things such as the COVID-19 situation. And as one person noted, when nobody corresponds with you, the impact of the virus is greater than it should be. They were also concerned that the doctors would be able to distinguish between their own health symptoms with their disease as MPN patients or related to COVID-19. And there were also some concerns that certain people had received shielding letters where others had not, and it seemed to be at random. The second theme was about people's concerns regarding exposure to or the risk of contracting COVID-19. A large group of people answering their answers fitting this theme was about this topic. So the risk of exposure to in hospitals, cancer centers, or their GP's office. They wondered, would it be safe to attend their next clinic appointment, going for their regular blood tests, or having them taken at all? A smaller percentage was also concerned about poor outcomes from COVID, because as their condition is rare, they wonder if people will be able to treat them well in terms of recognizing symptoms or being immune compromised, putting them at greater risk of having a severe outcome if they develop COVID-19. Another 15% of the people who wrote an answer that we fit into this theme were concerned that their condition might be worsening because they were not receiving regular monitoring tests or due to isolation. One person wrote, I'm worried my bloods are bad. This is another concern that people have with MPN. Our key findings at this point, and we're still continuing with analysis, is that MPN patients are reporting worse symptoms than previous studies had shown. Many MPN patients are shielding or living alone, and they're concerned about how their health has been affected because of this during the pandemic. There's also a lot of uncertainty about how to safely access care, such as regular blood tests to monitor their health. What's next? Well, we will be completing in-depth analysis of all the answers, sorting the difference by males and females, older and younger, living in the UK or elsewhere. We'll provide findings to healthcare professionals and charities. And we're also planning to conduct 2 rounds of follow-up surveys. 75% of the participants who had sent back a survey had agreed to do this either in September or also perhaps in January. And as Dr. Anderson had mentioned before, the survey is still open so people could complete this first survey if they wished. Again, you can see there is the website where people can access the survey. It's on a platform called SurveyMonkey. And we want to acknowledge the research team. The principal or main investigators are Professor Leslie Anderson, who is here today with me, and Dr. Charlene McShane, who is at Queen's University, and Leslie is at the University of Aberdeen. We have collaborators at the University of Aberdeen with a wide range of expertise, and also several collaborators beyond myself at Queen's University in Belfast.
Thank you to both Leslie and to Lynn for all this useful information that's come out of the research that they've done. Thank you so much. I would now like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Mary Frances McMullen, who is going to update us on the Mosaic study. I know that this study means so much to so many of the patients who always seem to ask, how did I get an MPN? Welcome, Mary Frances.
So the Mosaic study, which was actually a pilot study, was supported by MPN Voice. And in this study, we were particularly interested in looking at the factors that are associated with the development of myeloproliferative neoplasms. We did a lot of work in this study and had some very exciting findings, as well as the best ways to actually carry out such an epidemiological study. This just shows you one of the findings which excites everyone, because in this we looked at the symptomatology of patients, which are the red line, compared to the controls, which are the blue line. And you can see that the patients have much higher scores on all the symptomatology and have much more symptoms than normal controls. There were other things from the Mosaic study that we were actually able to analyse, even though it was only a small pilot study. Just an example, factors associated with myeloproliferative neoplasms are more than one child in the bedroom in childhood. And of course, this may be a reflection of other things like lower socioeconomic status. So having carried out this study, we have now spent the last few years raising money from MPN Voice and other sources in order to carry out a much bigger Mosaic study looking at the etiology of myeloproliferative neoplasms in multiple sites. This slide shows you there's various sites that have signed up for this, and we hope to get this going here and beyond the UK. We were all ready to go, having just about raised enough money to get started when, of course, COVID came along. But we've been struggling our way through this, and we hope very much that we are just about to start. And certainly my ambition is to ensure that the first patient is into the study before the end of August. So this is the Mosaic study, which will be the biggest epidemiological study of myeloproliferative neoplasms ever carried out in the world. Funding is still an issue. MPN Voice have been pivotal in helping us with funding, but I do draw attention to the fact that there is a Just Giving page, because we still have to keep trying to get funding to do this study as well as we can. What do we aim to evaluate? Well, we will in this study evaluate lifestyle factors, occupation, quality of life, as I showed you before, and exposures, and all things that may be involved in the development of myeloproliferative neoplasms. We also are trying to collect biological specimens in this, and what we will have with that is a large collection of basically DNA from patients and controls, which will be pivotal for further studies. And we'll also look at the unmet needs of patients. So final slide is just about the eligibility to take part in the study, because everyone, when they hear this, is very keen to be part of this study. We'll be looking to myeloproliferative patients to take part, and also asking them to help us recruit the controls, which will be non-blood relative or friend controls. We're looking for patients with myeloproliferative neoplasms, but we want particularly patients diagnosed within the previous 24 months. Now that will annoy people because everybody wants to take part, but in order to get as clean a study as possible, which will give us the most information, we need to look at the more recently diagnosed patients. And then, as I stated, we'll be looking as the best method of doing this as getting the patients to help us recruit controls who need to be non-blood relative or friends of the patients over 18. We're asking patients to recruit patients of the same gender so that we get the balance right, and with an age range of 10 years on either side of the patient. So we're very excited now that at last the Mosaic definitive study is about to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Frances. It's always good to hear what's going on with Mosaic. And as I said earlier, it really means a lot to so many of us. Thank you. We'd now like to welcome Dr. Donal McLaunan, who's going to give us the updates from the European Hematological Association research. Thank you, Donal.
So welcome everyone. This morning I'm going to bring us through some of the relevant abstracts and presentations from EHA, which for this year was virtual. Really what I want to focus on over the next few minutes is some updated data from the interim analysis of Rho-PEG interferon. So that's pegylated interferon, that's from AOP Pharma. As regards myelofibrosis, I want to focus on the concept of ruxolitinib discontinuation syndrome. And I want to provide some updates from clinical trials, such as the MANIFEST study and KRT 232. So if we focus on polycythemia vera, there was an update from Professor Baubui about a phase 2 randomized clinical trial that was comparing Rho-PEG interferon versus phlebotomy, i.e. venesection, in low-risk patients with PV. So this was the pre-planned interim analysis of the low PV trial. So this is a phase 2 study, and as we're all aware, for patients less than the age of 60 with polycythemia vera and no history of thrombosis who are defined as low risk, phlebotomy alone is considered the standard of care. However, for us within the MPN community, it is still unclear whether phlebotomy alone is enough to maintain the hematocrit below 45% over time. And we know that if it rises above that significantly and is unaddressed, there is a higher risk of cardiovascular or thrombotic complications. So an unanswered question is, does the addition of additional cytoreductive therapy, such as Rho-PEG interferon, lead to more robust outcomes within patients with PV who are defined as low risk? And to try to address some of these questions, there was the design of a phase 2 study that plans to enroll a total of 150 patients with polycythemia vera who are determined as low risk. And just to recap, that's less than the age of 60 with no history of cardiovascular or thrombotic complications. This interim analysis was randomized patients 1-to-1, so there are 50 patients in both arms. When the trial completes, there will be 75 patients in both arms, and randomized patients between phlebotomy and aspirin versus phlebotomy and aspirin with the addition of Rho-PEG interferon. The primary endpoint of the trial was to assess the proportion of responders at the 1-year mark. And by responders for the primary endpoint, we mean where the median hematocrit is maintained less than 45% and with the absence of disease progression. In the second year of the study, and this is the switch extension phase, for patients on phlebotomy and aspirin who are responding and meet the primary endpoint, they can continue in the same arm, but if they're not responding, they can switch to the same cohort as phlebotomy and aspirin, but with the addition of Rho-PEG interferon. So when we look at the initial interim analysis, and it's important to stress that this is an interim analysis, we can see that for the primary endpoint, so again, maintaining hematocrit below 45% and no evidence of disease progression, this favoured the cohort which is shown in the red bar. 84% of patients within that cohort met that primary endpoint versus only 60% in the standard of care, which is phlebotomy and aspirin. When we look at hematocrit control, we additionally see that more patients in the Rho-PEG interferon arm achieved the hematocrit control endpoint. Importantly to note, for patients, the numbers of phlebotomies required was significantly lower in those patients who were receiving row-peg interferon versus the standard phlebotomy arm. We know that with PV there can be a large number or a small number or non-existent symptoms. So it's a very heterogeneous disorder as regards what symptoms patients may experience. Importantly, for those patients who were treated with row-peg interferon 2 beta, overall there was a 21% reduction in symptoms that are classically associated with PV. And of interest, you can see here that there was the downward facing bars show a reduction in symptoms versus the upward facing, which show over time an increase in symptoms. And here we can see on the left side that there's reduction in symptoms such as night sweats and most importantly itching, whereas in the standard arm this was not seen across the board. So certainly as regards symptom improvement and control, this favoured the addition of row-peg interferon. So this interim analysis fully demonstrates that row-peg interferon in low-risk PV is more efficacious in keeping the hematocrit at target levels in comparison to a strict and rigorous phlebotomy policy only. Importantly, in addition to better hematocrit target control, patients presented with a reduction in the numbers of phlebotomy required and a better quality of life, but this requires longer follow-up, and secondary endpoints such as changes in bone marrow pathology, quality of life measures, and overall numbers of phlebotomy required will be seen as the trial data matures. So next, switching to ruxolitinib discontinuation syndrome, there was a presentation by the Italian group by Francesca Palandri, which tries to define such a concept of ruxolitinib discontinuation syndrome, or RDS. This can be thought of as significant symptoms that occur following discontinuation of ruxolitinib, usually manifested as a marked rebound in splenomegaly, plus or minus a rebound in symptoms. This can commonly be occurring within the first 3 weeks following discontinuation of ruxolitinib, and it happens due to a massive release of inflammatory cytokines, which can drive the spleen progression and also drive the symptoms. And this is a very important consideration when we're switching between therapies, consideration for stopping or tapering down ruxolitinib prior to clinical trials, and also for when we're stopping or tapering ruxolitinib prior to transplantation. So there were 251 patients treated with ruxolitinib, and overall ruxolitinib discontinuation syndrome was observed in 13.5%. It's important to stress that the vast majority had either mild or moderate ruxolitinib discontinuation syndrome, and almost 87% of patients did not. So although it can occur, it is a more unusual occurrence, but it is very important to be aware. For those patients who had mild or moderate RDS, this was predominantly a symptomatic increase in spleen, and there could have been also symptom rebound. For mild RDS, 14% of patients required reintroduction of JAK inhibitor, and this was 30% for those with moderate RDS. When we think about the timing of the events, for mild or moderate RDS, this commonly occurs within 7 to 10 days, but it was usually much quicker, happening within 48 hours for those with severe RDS. And part of it reflects not only the disease stage and how inflammatory the disease is at the time of discontinuation, but also how the ruxolitinib is handled and whether it's stopped abruptly or it's tapered correctly prior to switching therapy or moving on with other treatment modalities. There are a host of agents that are currently in either early or late stage clinical trials, and here we can see some of the overall concepts, whether they're agents that are acting as monotherapy, so single agents, or agents that are in combination commonly with ruxolitinib. And really the focus of the clinical trials for myelofibrosis has either been upfront treatment, often of new drugs in combination with JAK inhibitor, or how we manage patients who've potentially been treated with ruxolitinib and unfortunately have been intolerant or lost their response to ruxolitinib. One of the interesting compounds that some of us in the audience will have had familiarity with that's been open across the UK is KRT232. So this is an oral MDM2 inhibitor. So this is a potent selective inhibitor of MDM2, and it offers the potential to deliver disease-modifying effects by ultimately affecting the MPN stem and progenitor cells. We know that MDM2 is overexpressed, particularly in patients with myelofibrosis, but also in patients with polycythemia vera, when we compare it to individuals who do not have an MPN. The MPN-associated driver mutations can lead to upregulation indirectly of MDM2, and that affects a protein which is known as P53. And if there's abrogation of the normal function of P53, that ultimately propagates proliferation, which is a hallmark feature of MPN. The KR2T232 trial initially had 3 cohorts and then extended to 4, and looked at differing dosages of the agent, commonly given for 1 to 7 days over either a 21 or 28-day period, to find the safest and most efficacious dosing schedule. And like most trials in myelofibrosis, we were looking at spleen and symptom responses. Here we can see the 240 milligram dose on a 28-day dose schedule. And we're seeing that when we look at this spleen volume reduction, and we're targeting by imaging at least 35% reduction from baseline spleen size, we can see this is reached in around 16% of patients. And in this trial, these patients had previously failed ruxolitinib. And as regards symptom control, we're seeing around 30% of patients get a 50% reduction in the baseline symptoms. So this is an interesting compound. It's the first clinical proof of concept study highlighting the important role of MDM inhibition. And there will be a phase 3 trial that will be rolled out across certain European centres. Next, we have the Manifest study. This is a BET inhibitor, so CPI-0610 is what's called a BET inhibitor. So BET proteins have multiple functions, and BET proteins act as readers within the epigenome. And that's involved in MPN maintenance and also inflammation. And when we inhibit these BET proteins, what we're trying to do is to establish more normal hematopoiesis, or blood cell production. You can see that in the MPN setting, the BET proteins are involved in driving pro-inflammatory cytokines, and also they drive the blood cell factory production towards more megakaryocytes, so platelet-making cell production, which behave abnormally, drive inflammation, and indirectly drive fibrosis. In the Manifest study, this was quite a complex phase 2 study with multiple arms, but really what we're looking at in patients who had previously been exposed to ruxolitinib but were no longer taking it, CPI-0610 alone. We were looking at patients who were still on ruxolitinib and adding in CPI-0610, and then looking at the combination of CPI-0610 and ruxolitinib for patients with myelofibrosis who had not been previously treated. The endpoints that the team were interested in were spleen and symptom responses, and also if patients were requiring transfusion, could we make them transfusion independent? Here we can see that we're seeing, if we think about arm 3, we're seeing improvements in spleen volume, we're seeing improvements in symptom scores. For a proportion of patients with anemia, we're seeing improvements in hemoglobin, and for some patients, we're seeing that if they were transfusion dependent, they can become transfusion independent. If you focus on the central slide, looking at the bone marrow pathology, in some responding patients, we're seeing establishment of more normal architecture within the bone marrow, and also a reduction in fibrosis. So not only are we seeing spleen and symptom improvements, but we're potentially also seeing disease modifications. There's a lot of detail on this slide, and I will summarize it in the next slide, and you will have these slides available. But really it tells us the percentage of patients who are getting spleen responses, because if we look at arm 3, for example, and that's patients who've never been treated with ruxolitinib before, we're seeing that in 51 evaluable patients, when they were given the combination, 73% of patients achieved at least a 35% reduction in spleen volume size at 12 weeks, and there was a median spleen volume reduction of 51%. So in conclusion, it appears that CPI-0610 in combination with ruxolitinib, or as a monotherapy, showed preliminary evidence of clinical activity and potential disease-modifying effects. We're seeing that It's generally well tolerated either alone or in combination with ruxolitinib, and this will be proceeding to a phase 3 trial, which is eagerly awaited. An interesting compound to look out for is parsaclisib, which is a PI3K delta inhibitor. And again, there was a poster presentation at EHA this year focusing on patients who've had a suboptimal response to ruxolitinib, and 53 patients were treated. There was dose alteration as regards safety and as regards scheduling. But again, we're seeing at an early interim analysis, we're seeing significant clinical spleen responses. So this is an interesting drug that hopefully we'll see more of in the future when it's used in combination with ruxolitinib.
Thank you, Donal, for giving us so much information about all the wonderful research that's being done. And now I'd like to welcome Professor Claire Harrison, who is going to talk to us about the UK research. Welcome, Claire.
Hello, I'm Claire Harrison talking to you from Guy's and St Thomas's about current clinical trials in MPN. You've already heard a great presentation from Donal concerning current updates that were presented at the European Haematology Association, but we thought you might like to know what's currently happening about clinical trials in MPN. Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is for the NHS at the present time, most non-COVID related research has been paused. We have been continuing to follow up patients in clinical trials and treat them, but in general the research teams have been busy and many of our staff have been redeployed. You've heard from Adam about current research, and really the UK is, I'm happy to say, leading the field with regard to this. But here's an example on this slide and the next one regarding what we've been doing at Guy's and St Thomas's. So, for example, we've redeployed 145 of our clinical trial research staff across the organisation, for example, into intensive care and other sites. And we've also set up a completely bespoke COVID research team. We've been recruiting patients across the entire spectrum of ages and clinical pathways, including, for example, maternity, studying the effect of the coronavirus on these patients. As of June, we'd recruited 1,748 patients into urgent public health studies and 2,460 participants into other local studies, for example, our own critical care database, a database looking at the effect of coronavirus on cancer patients, maternity, children's, for example. This is just another way of looking at the impact of the research portfolio for coronavirus just in the Guy's and St Thomas's organisation alone. We've been setting up clinical trials very quickly, on average 13 days. We've got 10 clinical trials ongoing, including the vaccine study, which is very, very exciting and very important. We've also been collecting data, and we've pooled a lot of our patient records so that we can learn about different aspects of coronavirus. For example, the Evelina Children's Hospital at St Thomas's described the new novel COVID-19 paediatric syndrome, so-called PMSTS. So it's no wonder that we've had to pause some of our activity, but don't worry, we are starting it back up again. So current status of UK MPN trials is that many of them are reopening, and in fact we've been opening studies quite rapidly at Guy's and St Thomas's, and different centres will open at different rates according to the capacity to see patients and the number of staff they have in their research team. We've always been very proud of our research trial portfolio, and rather than go through this in great detail, because you can see it on the MPN Voice website, just wanted to highlight that our research trials span the entire course of the disease and include, for example, the Mosaic study, about which Mary Frances McMullen has updated you, sample banks from which we've described mutations such as JAK2, calreticulin, and we have a new initiative known as eMPN, which is a pan-European database aiming for 5,000 patients opening. This year we will open 2 new ET studies, including some of the compounds you've heard about from Donal, in particular CPI-0610 and a different compound, IMG7289 or bomedemstat. Our PV studies, Mithridate, which is our frontline study supported by MPN Voice, is also opening again. And all the MF studies mentioned by Donal and Moore will be open and available for patients in the UK. We're also expecting some important results from trials this year. The results of Tamarin, a study in the UK looking at tamoxifen and its role in patients with MPN, will be reporting at ASH, as will the Phasar study looking at patients with an increasing number of blasts and leukemia. Donal also showed you data with regard to the My MPN database, and with the MPN Research Foundation, we will continue to try to open this in the UK, but we have had some GDPR compliance issues so far. And just lastly, if you want to participate in research, I think there are some things that it's important to bear in mind. Providing data or samples can be just as important as drug studies. For example, all of the symptom tools that we've set up in collaboration with Ruben Messer and others, all of the samples that have been given that have allowed us to look at genomics and genomic classification of disease and prognosis. And if you're thinking of taking part in a drug study, remember, we usually test drugs to see if they are better, and some studies are randomized, so you may end up in the control arm. If you're thinking about taking part in a research study, you will be given a patient information sheet. Please read it carefully, look at the number of visits that are needed, and ask as many questions as you want. I look forward to joining you later for our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for your wonderful talk about the UK research agenda. We really look forward to having updates on these exciting projects. And now I'd like to welcome Professor Adam Mead, who's going to talk to us about the COVID research updates.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Adam Mead. I'm a haematologist at the University of Oxford, and I'm going to give you an update on clinical research into the coronavirus infection, particularly focusing on new therapies and vaccines in development. But one of the first things to remember when you're looking for new information about the coronavirus is be careful about misinformation, particularly from this man. So there's a lot of misinformation about, including new therapies, misinformation about vaccines, misinformation about masks, and so on and so forth. So you have to make sure you go to reputable sources. The way we find new therapies, and in fact, the progress has been really remarkable on this through international effort, particularly from the UK, is through clinical trials. And the UK is really leading the way here. And these have been developed incredibly quickly through the repurposing of already available drugs. So that means we're taking drugs that are already approved to treat other diseases to see if they are effective to treat coronavirus. And broadly, the drugs that are being tested fall into three categories, and I'll talk through some of these. Antiviral treatments, anti-inflammatory or immune therapy type of treatments, and blood thinning treatments. And the idea is all of these can either stop the replication or block the virus or block consequences of the viral infection. In the UK in particular, thanks to the NHS and our centralised national health system and National Institute for Health Research, have really led the way in this clinical research effort, and internationally have made some of the biggest contributions to our understanding of new therapies. And that is mostly through this trial, the recovery trial, which was so far quite remarkably, given that it's only been open for about 3 months now, has already recruited over 12,000 participants at over 170 different sites. So I'm going to talk through some of the therapies that have been tested. And there are a bewildering number of these repurposed therapies that are being tested for treatment of coronavirus. I'm going to focus on some of these. So corticosteroids, treatment that's been around for decades and in the headlines quite recently, Interferon, of course, a treatment that many people with myeloproliferative neoplasms will be aware of, an antiviral treatment called remdesivir, and some anti-inflammatory treatments, tocilizumab, and I'm also going to mention a convalescent plasma that is being tested in the recovery trial. But the first thing to talk about is probably the earliest treatment that was proposed to be an effective treatment for coronavirus infection was hydroxychloroquine, which is an anti-malarial treatment that has been around for many decades. And Donald Trump and Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, have both taken this drug on the basis of zero evidence that it works. So here is a couple of examples of clinical trials. The best quality data, and many of you might have taken part in these types of trials, comes from randomized trials, where you randomly assign patients either to a control group where they do not receive the treatment, or a treatment group where they do. And that gives you the gold standard evidence. Always be cautious of any trials that report just one arm of a study without any kind of what we call control group, because that can be very, very biased. So what these curves show you is the event-free survival of patients who were randomized either to receive no hydroxychloroquine in blue or hydroxychloroquine in red. And you can see that the patients who received hydroxychloroquine in a non-significant way are doing slightly worse from those that did. And there are many, many different trials showing this. So it's clear that hydroxychloroquine is not an inverted commas, game changer for the treatment of this disease. One treatment that does look quite interesting is more of an immune than an antiviral therapy, but it could be classified as either, is interferon beta. So interferon alpha is a treatment that's often used for the treatment of myeloproliferative neoplasms. Interferon beta is in the same family of treatments. Actually, in these trials is given in inhaled formulation. And there's a number of studies now that have been reported showing that the treatment groups, so those that receive interferon beta, manage to clear the virus more effectively than those patients in the light blue color in these curves that did not receive that treatment. So that looks like quite a promising treatment. I think most folks are thinking at the moment it is probably a good treatment early on in the course of the disease to prevent the deterioration of patients to more severe forms of coronavirus infection, and not a good treatment for later stages. Another treatment that has been in the headlines is remdesivir, which is an antiviral treatment originally developed for the treatment of Ebola, but repurposed for the treatment of coronavirus. And there was one disappointing randomized trial that did not show a benefit of remdesivir treatment in terms of the improvement rate, but this was quite a small study run in China that failed to recruit because the epidemic was kept under control in China, and you can see a marginal benefit but non-statistically significant. But the National Institute for Health in the United States ran a much bigger study and did show a highly statistically significant benefit for patients receiving this antiviral treatment. It seems to be patients who receive it quite early on in the disease course who benefit. So they recover and are discharged from hospital earlier than those patients treated with placebo, with a suggestion, albeit non-statistically significant, of a benefit in terms of the mortality rate, the risk of dying as a result of coronavirus infection. Really, the most successful trial to date came out of the UK. This was a randomized study testing the anti-inflammatory treatment dexamethasone, randomized study between usual care, dexamethasone treatment, overall showing a clear mortality benefit. This was a simple trial just looking at the chance of the patient being alive, highly statistically significant because this was a huge study of many thousands of patients. But notably, this treatment seems to be most effective in the patients who have more severe disease, either requiring ventilatory support or oxygen therapy, showing highly statistically significant benefit, but no benefit in patients who do not require oxygen therapy, so something for the later stages of the disease. Tocilizumab is another anti-inflammatory treatment that has shown some promise. Ruxolitinib, many patients with MPN will be aware of, is a JAK2 inhibitor. This is also being tested in clinical trials, some of which are in the UK, to treat more severe forms of coronavirus infection. Interestingly, this is a non-randomized study, but still I think of interest that patients with coronavirus, as you've probably heard, seem to be at particular risk of developing blood clots. And patients that receive anticoagulation in hospital, particularly the sickest patients, seem to be at lower risk of developing blood clots than those that did not receive anticoagulation. So there are randomized trials now testing this approach formally. Antibody therapies are being developed, so they are either being engineered, so in the laboratory actually making the antibodies and making antibody therapies, and there are a number of these that have now been fully developed and are going into clinical trials. The faster way to develop antibodies as a therapy is actually to take convalescent plasma from people that have recovered from coronavirus infection and have developed natural antibodies, and you can take those antibodies by blood donation and test those as a treatment for coronavirus. And that is one of the arms of the recovery study that is currently recruiting. One of the interesting things in terms of natural immunity is there appears to be a lot of people in society as a whole who have not been exposed to COVID-19 who do appear to have some natural immunity against the virus. One recent study published just a couple of days ago suggests that about 1/3 of the population already have some T cells, that's the cellular part of the immune system, against the coronavirus protein. So that is a bit of good news, I think, in terms of the likelihood that we actually have broader immunity in the community than we might otherwise have expected on the basis of antibody tests alone. So finally, I want to talk about vaccines, which are, I think, the best hope for us to have an exit strategy, if you like, from the coronavirus pandemic. There are many vaccines that are in development. Typically, the vaccine development process takes many, many years, usually 5 to 6 years as a minimum, in order to have a functional and operational vaccine that can be used as a public health measure. In the coronavirus pandemic, that has been accelerated to a really remarkable degree. There are over 160 vaccines in development, and remarkably, 3 of those are really leading the way and are already in later stage clinical trials. One of them comes from the University of Oxford, and already over 6,000 people have been randomized. This vaccine, as shown here, has been shown to induce very strong immune responses in patients that receive the vaccine, to a similar level to those seen from patients who are recovering from viral infection. And because of these strong preliminary data, we are still awaiting actual, what we would say, efficacy data. So whilst we know the vaccine induces immune responses, we do not know whether it protects from coronavirus in humans. We do not know whether it reduces the risk of death if you do get coronavirus infection. That will require a much bigger study, which is underway in the UK with thousands of participants, and also in Brazil. The challenge in the UK is that there is thankfully not enough coronavirus about at the moment to answer this question, which is why they opened the study in Brazil. On the basis of the encouraging data of these immune responses, the University of Oxford and the UK government have already struck a deal with AstraZeneca to develop and produce up to 1 billion doses of of this particular vaccine. But there are other vaccines. That the Oxford vaccine is a so-called adenovirus vaccine. So it is a live virus vaccine, and that has got some potential problems associated with it. There are other vaccines in development, and there was a very recent publication on the Moderna. This is a US vaccine, which is the so-called mRNA vaccine, again showing similar immunogenicity, so a similar ability to induce an immune response. Here are the controls who didn't receive the vaccine. Very strong antibody responses in patients that received the mRNA vaccine. So many very promising vaccine candidates. The challenge is simply to run a very large trial to prove that it prevents infection or prevents severe infection or complications to the infection. And that's what the researchers are grappling with at the moment. But still, remarkable progress is being made. So that's everything I wanted to say, and there'll be a chance to ask questions about my presentation during the Q&A session that will be coming up soon. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Adam, for such a useful talk. This is so relevant to all our lives at the moment. Our next topic is the regional updates on shielding, including what to expect in a hospital, returning to work, going to school, and making sure that you are COVID safe. From Scotland, I would like to welcome Dr. Mark Drummond.
Okay, thanks for the invite. Just to give a brief update on the situation with COVID and MPN patients and other patients, in fact. In Scotland, I've been asked to concentrate particularly on the shielding rules and regulations, which are changing in actual fact today, the day of the talk, 1st of August. So in Scotland, we identified shielding patients, MPN and otherwise, via the National Chemotherapy Prescribing System. That's a system that's linked between all the different health boards and can allow us to search for patients on particular treatments. Importantly, we were allowed to manually override this, so we could add patients in who we thought should be shielding. Equally, we could take patients off who we felt shouldn't be shielding, acknowledging that shielding was a big ask for many patients, and it wouldn't be something we'd want to recommend unnecessarily. Broadly speaking, patients in watch and wait, aspirin only, hydroxycarbamide and agrolide, the common drugs for MPNs, were not identified as needing shielding in line with the other colleagues in the UK, i.e. most MPN patients. So the patients we focused on for shielding requirements were patients on ruxolitinib, given potential concerns around immune suppression with that drug, and patients who'd had a previous stem cell transplant, which will apply to a small minority of MPN patients. So very quickly, like other areas of the UK, we had to put in place solutions to allow ongoing patient management. This included remote consultations, mainly via telephone, but increasingly using dedicated video applications. Medicines delivery, all patients in shielding are now getting medicines delivered via post, and community blood testing in COVID safe and distanced community and hospital blood testing hubs. We have greatly limited our physical appointments, like everyone else, excuse me, and our health board in Glasgow, where I work, which is the biggest health board in Scotland, has recommended that 70% of all consultations we should target as for remote consultations, telephone or video. We will see patients physically if there's a change in symptoms down the telephone or other concerns, or they require a change in therapy. So in terms of advice in Scotland going forward, there's the web address, and I suggest you check that because it's continually updated if you want the most up-to-date information. This is up-to-date information as of a few days ago. The government in Scotland has decreed that shielding will be paused on the 1st of August. Note the word paused, indicating that they could reactivate it at fairly short notice at some point in the future if deemed necessary, but it's not being stopped. To facilitate this, realising it's difficult for patients coming out of shielding for a whole lot of reasons, the aim to, how deliverable this will be, but the aim to give individual patient information about risk of condition, give access to local infection rates, and with that information the aim is to for people to make informed choices. And of course many of the questions we get is the ability to return to work. And as of 1st of August, the government has also stated that patients who have been shielding can return to a COVID-safe workplace as of 1st of August. I would recommend that patients in Scotland sign up to the SMS shielding service. The details are at the web address above. All you have to do is text your CHI number, the Scottish equivalent of the NHS number, and you will be kept up to date and informed directly by text of any changes to this policy. And that's really all I wanted to say. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mark. From Northern Ireland, Professor Mary Francis is going to update us.
COVID in Northern Ireland. We have been extremely fortunate in Northern Ireland that the rate of COVID has been low. Obviously, we have had cases and particular problems with nursing homes as elsewhere, but overall the rate is low, and certainly now it is extremely low, if there at all. From the point of view of our shielding patients, shielding finishes at the end of July, has just happened. So where do we go from here? Well, the clinical services, we are really back up and running in haematology as much as possible. The hospitals are extremely safe. Everything has been looked at. There are one way in, one way out, masks, things have been moved around. So we would want to be really reassuring that patients should come to the hospital, should be seen, but we're also talking to them on the phone, sending medication to them at home if that is more appropriate. We do want to now try to get patients coming back to see us so that we can help as much as possible. I'm not sure about schools, but I hope the schools will be returning at the beginning of September, and certainly people can get back to work as much as possible. However, we all need to keep safe. We all need to practice social distancing, and I think this is likely to be the case for many months to come. I'm always interested in this, listening to people. I tell the story of hearing an opera singer who said about the problem of COVID, and she said, but I can't get the cold, so I've been practicing social distancing for years, going through airports, staying away from people, and I haven't had any infections for years. So this is something that we will all have to do for some time to keep all of us safe. However, and of course we worry that there will be further second waves, or maybe even second ripples, but we want to continue to keep as safe as possible.
And welcome to Claire Woodley, our clinical nurse specialist here at Guy's. She is going to update us on England.
Shielding in England. This information is correct as of the 24th of July. From the 1st of August, the government will pause shielding in England unless the transmission of COVID-19 starts to significantly rise in the community. What does this mean for patients? Well, the National Shielding Service will stop free food parcels and medicines deliveries. Priority online supermarket deliveries will continue if you registered on the government website as being shielded before the 17th of July. The NHS volunteer service will continue, and this service can deliver shopping that you purchase or collect and deliver medicines for you. It is advised that from this time you follow the general guidelines on reducing the possibility of catching the virus. So this is maintaining social distancing, hand hygiene and wearing face coverings. Whilst the government have said that you can return to work if it is a COVID secure environment, they have also said that if it's possible to continue to work from home. During this time, the shielding list will be maintained to allow those at risk to receive a rapid advice if there is a change in the shielding advice. We will move on. So common questions that we have come across. My employer wants me to return to work, but what is a COVID secure environment? This would include being able to social distance from your colleagues, so maintaining a 1 to 2 metre distance from them, the use of appropriate PPEs provided to you. Now, the exact needs will depend on where it is that you're due to work, but please discuss with your employer. Your employer can help with the transition back into work and will be able to provide risk assessments as appropriate and to also arrange appointments with occupational health if required. Can I attend my hospital appointments? As I'm sure for many hospitals, we at Guy's have developed a number of processes that are in place for patients to safely attend their appointments. The treating team has reviewed which patients they feel are appropriate to attend their appointments, and there are a number of changes that you will see when you visit the hospital. We, for instance, have a one-way system around our hospital. Everybody is provided with masks when they enter the hospital, and there are numerous hand hygiene stations positioned around the hospital. We have also been looking at different ways of working and managing our clinics. So for a lot of patients, you may have experienced remote clinic appointments. These may be through video calls or through telephone calls. And we've also been working very closely with our community colleagues so that blood tests and medication can be delivered to you whilst you're at home. Can I now go out more? Yes, you can. You can go out to buy food, to exercise, places of worship. But in general, it's important to remember the general guidelines for reducing your risk for COVID. Can my children return to school? Currently, the government advice is that they are hoping that all children will return to school in September. If you have concerns about this, it's important to discuss this with your child's school.
From Wales, Professor Claire Harrison is going to update us.
Hello, I'm Claire Harrison. You might be a little bit surprised to hear me talking about shielding in Wales, but believe it or not, I was born in Wales, and unfortunately Steve Napper has taken a well-earned holiday, and so I'm talking about the information that's available regarding shielding in Wales, which was correct as of the 26th of July when I prepared the slide. Infection rates in Wales are generally lower than those in England, but the plan is to pause shielding in Wales from the 16th of August. And at that time, the Chief Medical Officer for Wales will write to everyone who's shielding and advising them what to do next. The advice that's available on the website is as follows. You can go to work as long as the workplace is COVID secure. We have had some discussion about that already. But generally, the advice would be to carry on working from home if you can. You can go outside to buy food with advice of keeping 2 meters or, more easy to remember, 3 steps away wherever possible. If you're receiving a food box, you'll continue to receive them until the 16th of August. And a tricky one and a frequently asked question, children and young people can go back to school or college and university. Thanks.
I think you will all agree that we have received some incredibly useful information as we come into this new normal. And I would like to thank the team of doctors and Claire Woodley who have given us such really helpful advice. Thank you all. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Abby Wickham from the Guy's and St Thomas's psychology team. Dr. Wickham is going to talk to us about looking after yourself and bridging into the new normal.
Welcome everyone to our event today, and thank you so much for listening in to my webinar here today. So my name's Abby. I'm a clinical psychologist working in the haematology department at Guy's Hospital. So I'm going to take a bit of time today just to talk to you about the psychological impact of COVID-19 and to have a think about some skills and strategies that might be helpful for you in coping with some of the challenges that you might be facing now or challenges that you might be facing in the future. Okay. So I've put together a list here which is based really on conversations that myself and my team have had with patients in our service, that we've had with each other, that we've had with friends and family, to highlight some of the main challenges and difficulties that COVID-19 has brought to us so far. So for many of us, we've found that we've not had contact with loved ones in the same way that we usually do, and that might mean that we're not seeing them as frequently as usual. It might mean that we can't see people face to face, or if we do, we can't get close to them. A lot of us have had changes in our jobs, whether that's things like working from home or different precautions we have to take at work, or ways of working that are different now. For some of us, we may have been furloughed, and for some of us, we might be facing job insecurity and a lot of uncertainty there. A lot of us have found there's changes to our healthcare, different things that we might have to consider that we didn't before, different ways that we engage with our healthcare professionals. We might now be having some virtual appointments rather than face-to-face appointments. We might find that when we come to have our appointments, the way that that's done looks very different. We might also find that some of our appointments have been postponed or cancelled, and we don't know when they'll be rescheduled. Most of us, we've definitely experienced some changes in our daily activity to all sorts of different levels here. How we spend our time each day might look very different from how we did before. A lot of us has found that we're having to look for different ways to promote our well-being. Maybe activities we were used to doing before that would make us feel healthy or happy or fulfilled might not be available to us now, or not available to us in the same way as it was before. We're all having to be much more vigilant of our actions, having to think more carefully about certain things we do in ways that we didn't before. For example, different hygiene practices, social distancing, shielding. For a lot of us, we may have found that we've had to slow down quite a bit in our day-to-day life. If you were somebody who is very busy with lots of different commitments, you might find that that looks very different for you right now, and that might sometimes feel like a negative thing, and for some people feel like a positive thing. I think all of us are dealing with a great deal of uncertainty at the moment, in lots of different ways, not knowing the answers to all the questions we might have, and not knowing what the future might look like. And for a lot of us, we've had some challenges along the way in ensuring some of our basic needs are met. So in the beginning of the pandemic, there were lots of problems about getting certain supplies. I'm thinking specifically about things like toilet paper here. And for those of us that have had to shield or stay at home, we've maybe had difficulties getting food delivered to us, and things have not been accessible as we were maybe used to before. So what kind of impact have some of those challenges, and many more that you may have been facing during this time, had on how we're feeling and our sense of well-being? So I've listed here some different emotions and experiences that I've heard a lot, again, from colleagues, patients, friends and family. A lot of people are experiencing a sense of loneliness or isolation at the moment, not being able to see people in the same way that they were used to. A lot of people are feeling fear at the moment, not knowing what will happen, fear about becoming unwell, what that will mean, fear about our loved ones becoming unwell, fear of what the future will hold. You've probably at some point experienced anger or frustration, being really annoyed that maybe you cannot do certain things, really annoyed you're stuck indoors, really annoyed that you've had to cancel important plans. You may have also experienced some sadness or some grief about things that you're not able to do, maybe events or celebrations that you're missing out on, holidays you've had to cancel. And for some of us, unfortunately, we may feel sadness and grief about people that we've lost during this period of time as well. A lot of people have experienced confusion, not knowing what's for the best, hearing lots of mixed messages about what we should be doing, what advice we should listen to. Some of us have felt very trapped or out of control at points, not being able to change the pandemic, not being able to have full control over our lives in a way that we did before, feeling trapped quite literally indoors sometimes, and in other ways in the limited options and decisions that we might have at the moment. A lot of us have felt overwhelmed at times. If many of these feelings are happening for us on a regular basis, and many of the challenges I discussed before are happening for us, that's a lot to take in at one point and a lot to cope with, which sometimes can feel like too much. You might have noticed that you're sometimes feeling hopeless because we don't know what the future may hold. It might be easy to lose hope that things will feel better or seem better soon. And actually, something that people have reported is a positive feeling, a sense of relief that's come out of this. So the idea that actually when you live with an MPN, sometimes you do have to take life at a slower pace than you may see other people doing. You may experience symptoms like fatigue, which means you have to think a bit more carefully about the care plans you do or the responsibilities you take on. You may have already been experiencing a lot of concerns about your health and having to think about your health frequently in ways that people who don't have an MPN may not have to do. And what some people have reported to us, that actually there's a sense of relief that the world is slowing down a little bit in a way that feels more manageable, and that people might be able to have a little bit of an understanding as to some of the challenges that you may have already been facing prior to this. So what are we facing next? The bottom line to this really is that this is completely uncertain, as with almost everything we've faced so far with this pandemic. It might be that there's changing to shielding. You may have already experienced this in your personal circumstances, that the advice that you're given now from your medical team might be different from before. Changes to the advice the government has given will, I'm sure, continue to change in the future. And a sense that, is there a new normal? What things will go back to normal and when? Will there be some things that we'll be doing differently for longer? Will they ever return to how they were? We just don't know. So how can I cope with this? This is probably the question that I'm asked a lot in my role, that I think about a lot myself, and that I think the questions that my friends, family and colleagues are all asking themselves. How can we cope with the different challenges that this pandemic is bringing for each of us? So I'm going to talk through a couple of different skills now that you might find helpful, some that you may already be trying yourselves or have tried, some that you may have been told by somebody else already. But hopefully within this list there'll be things that you can think about and take away that will help you cope with some of the challenges that you might be facing now or that you find you might be facing in the future. So the first thing that I would say is to remind yourself and remember that it is normal to feel any and all of the things that you're experiencing at the moment. This is a global pandemic, and unfortunately that means we're not supposed to feel okay all of the time. In fact, it might be a bit more unusual if we were. It's really normal to feel scared, frustrated, anxious, tired, fed up, maybe sometimes relieved. All of these things are okay. And in fact, things like anxiety and fear at the moment are in a way quite a healthy response for us, because we do have to be thoughtful at the moment and there are risks to us at the moment that were not present perhaps before. And what anxiety and fear does is remind us to pay attention to those things and to take notice of them. And one thing that I've mentioned before that we are certainly all facing, and I'm sure we'll continue to face, is a lot of uncertainty, and our brains really do not like uncertainty. Our brains like to understand everything that's going on, and our brains also like to believe that they can predict everything that will be happening in the future and what we can expect. And like most things in life, that is not possible at the moment for a lot of things. And what our brain does when it faces that difficulty is to respond with anxiety, to try and prompt us to do something. And of course, sometimes we can do something with the challenges we're facing, and sometimes we can't. So another piece of advice that I would give is to focus only on what you can control. So it's human nature, as I said, to want to control everything possible and have lots of certainty, but there are so many things at the moment, and quite honestly before, that are out of our control and that we cannot be uncertain about. And to try and change things that we cannot alter can actually bring additional frustration and suffering to the challenges that we're already facing. So what I would recommend is you look at the things that you actually can do and the choices that you actually do have, and focus your attention on those only. Another thing that I would suggest would be quite helpful is to notice and name what you're feeling. it's likely that you are or have or will experience a lot of difficult emotions during the pandemic, and we can often feel that ignoring or suppressing those emotions will help get rid of them, particularly if they feel overwhelming at times. And in fact, what people tend to find when they do that is it has the opposite effect. Our emotions tend to build up and eventually will overspill. So what can be much more useful is to acknowledge and notice what you're feeling when you're feeling it. And what people tend to find is that just diffuses the intensity of that emotion at least a little bit. And what some people find helpful is to talk through those kind of experiences with someone that they trust to help understand what's going on and to help release some of that tension that is building. Another thing that I would suggest is to stay in the present moment. So often with difficult emotions like anxiety, for example, or fear, they come hand in hand with a number of difficult thoughts, such as things like worries. And the thing with worries is that they place our mind very much in the future, or the future that we imagine will occur. And that brings us additional struggles to what we might be facing right now in the present moment. And there are also things that we can't do anything to change because we don't yet know what the future will hold. So what can be quite useful is to notice when your mind is doing that, when your mind is bringing you to the future rather than keeping you where you are now. And to actually focus on what your needs are now. What are the challenges I'm facing right now? What are the difficult experiences I'm having right now? And what do I need to manage those now? And you might find that it's a lot easier to manage some of the challenges you're facing when you look at things in that way. One thing that can really help to keep our minds in the present moment, but to also calm some of the intense emotions that we might experience at times, is to use some breathing exercises. So the reason why that's quite helpful is because, as I'm sure most of you have experienced, that when you feel a very difficult and intense emotion, you will also feel some quite difficult and challenging physical experiences as well. So for example, if you're feeling a lot of anxiety or fear, you might notice things like your heart racing. You might notice that you can feel it pounding in your chest in a way that you couldn't before. You might then find that your breathing becomes shallower and quicker. You might find that you sweat or you become hot. And those things are very closely linked. So the more that we feel the emotion, the more that we're going to feel the physical elements of that as well. So the more anxious you are, the more you're likely to feel your heart racing, your breath quickening, feeling very hot and tense. So the relationship between those two things works both ways. So if we have more anxiety, we get more physical symptoms, and if we get more physical symptoms, we get more anxiety. So one way to take control of that really uncomfortable pattern that we can get stuck in is to do something to regulate our physical experience a little bit. So one thing that a lot of people find quite helpful is to do a breathing exercise which controls the pace of your breath and brings it back down to a much more normal resting pace, which will help your anxiety to come back down to a normal resting pace for you as well. So I'll show you here just a suggestion of a breathing exercise. So this is a little bit different for each person because our own lung capacity and what's comfortable will slightly differ between us. But the first thing I would suggest you do is to make sure you're sitting upright and to place your hand on your diaphragm, which is sort of just underneath your lungs. And this helps you to be a bit more aware of your breath, because sometimes when you're feeling intense emotions, you're not noticing your breathing, but often it's much easier to follow your hand rising and falling and getting a sense of how quickly you're breathing in that way. So what I would start with is always breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, and in the middle of that try and have a moment where you hold your breath and pause. So you'll see on the slides here that I've made a suggestion about breathing in for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, exhaling for 6 seconds. This really differs between each person, so don't worry if this doesn't feel comfortable. What people normally find comfortable is to breathe out a bit longer than they breathe in, but not everybody. And 4 seconds does actually often feel like a long time to hold your breath. So what I would recommend before you have a go at this is have a bit of a practice when you're already feeling kind of calm. Get a sense of what your usual comfortable controlled deep breathing pace is, and then you know that for at times when you're experiencing difficult emotions and you want to use it to take down the intensity of those. What is quite important, as I said, we're experiencing potentially a lot of difficult emotions at the moment, and they're all natural, and for many of those examples it's not possible to fully get rid of them. We're supposed to be feeling some difficult emotions at the moment. But what is important when we're experiencing that is to see ourselves through to the other side and to take care of ourselves during that experience. So thinking about ways to comfort yourself when you're experiencing those things is really important. And I find that a good place to start is to think about things that you physically find soothing. So it's quite useful to think about it in the sense of, what do I find soothing in my four senses? So what things can I look at? What things can I hear? Can I touch? Can I taste? Or can I smell? And I've placed some examples at the bottom of things that people have said to me before they find quite useful to soothe themselves. So it might be something like burning a scented candle that you really like, listening to a calm or uplifting song, or snuggling up in a nice soft blanket. Distraction is quite a useful technique, which might sound a bit contradictory to what I said earlier about not ignoring or suppressing your emotions, but actually distraction's different because you acknowledge what you're feeling and you're choosing to spend a period of time taking your mind off it to give yourself a little bit of respite. It can be really tiring to experience difficult thoughts and emotions all day, every day. So if you're going through a period where there's difficulties that make you feel that way a lot of the time, it's important to take breaks from that where you can, so you can recharge. So thinking about activities that you can do that will help you to fully engage your mind in that activity, and going back to what we said earlier about being mindful of when you notice your brain thinking about other things, when you notice your brain focusing on worries or thinking about other things you need to do, notice that and just bring your mind back to that activity. And this is something that a lot of people have found very important but also very difficult during the pandemic, is to continue to do things that matter to you as an individual. And it might be that a lot of things that matter to you and that brought you positive experiences like pleasure, joy, a sense of calm or a sense of fulfillment are not available to you like they were before. So you might have to be very creative about how you would engage with these activities. So for example, for somebody who really liked to exercise before, they might have to think very differently about how they might do that indoors, or ways they might do that outdoors without access to a gym. And this is something that's really important to think about right now, is making decisions that are right for you as an individual. So at the moment, what a lot of people are finding is there is not a blanket guidance for everybody, and it's different for each person and their circumstances. And so people are beginning to make decisions about how they want to conduct their day-to-day life. And what's really important in that is to think about familiarising yourself with the advice specific to you and your condition and your circumstances. So this might be taking into account things like your specific diagnosis, any other health conditions you may or may not have, and what particular treatment you might be on. And it's really important that you take into account what advice you've been told by your medical team as to what elements of this are important for you to hold in mind. And it's important when you're thinking about decisions to weigh up the benefits and risks, and often what we find when we're making decisions is that it's unlikely there is an option which is perfect and risk-free, which can make it quite difficult for us to come to a conclusion about what we want to do. So it's important that we're weighing that up. We're acknowledging what are the benefits of me doing said thing and what are the risks that could be involved. And acknowledging that there is a degree of risk in everything that you do. And with COVID, there's no way at the moment to categorically guarantee that somebody will not catch it. And that's important to hold in mind. It's also important to think about what resources and knowledge that you have and really trust that. You know about your condition, you know how your body works, and you know what experiences you've had so far. And think about what precautions you can take, what advice you have been given, and how you can use all of that to make the best choice for you at any given moment. Another thing I would advise is that you take gradual steps. So it might be the case that either now or previously or in the future, the things that you are able to do or the things that you have been advise is okay to do, or the things that you wish to do might be different from in previous moments in the pandemic. And that can feel quite daunting to maybe go back to activities that you haven't done for a long time that might feel scary or carry some risks for you. And it's important to think about easing back into anything that you wish to in a gradual way, and not to expect yourself to be able to jump right back in as if the pandemic had never happened. And it's important to remember at this time to expect anxiety. When you go back to doing something you haven't done for a while, it's completely natural and healthy to feel nervous about that. And to hold in mind that the more that you do something, the more comfortable that it's likely to feel for you over time. And I've included a picture here of something our psychologists like to talk about a lot, the idea of a stress bucket. So it's the idea that we don't have an infinite capacity for stress, and that's why it's important to think about ways that we can alleviate and manage it. So the idea of the stress bucket is that the water that fills the bucket is all the different things in your life that might be challenging and causing you different types of stress. So maybe some of the things we talked about at the start of this webinar, maybe some additional things that are going on in your life, or maybe some things that I haven't mentioned today. So the more water that fills in that bucket, the more and more you get closer to your full capacity, where you're not able to hold any more stress in that bucket. And so what's really important is to think about ways that you can drain some of that water from your stress bucket, drill some holes in the bottom so that you've got capacity for more should it come your way. So I'm hoping today that some of the things that we've talked about might sound useful to you and might serve as the drill that you can use to put a hole in the bottom of your stress bucket and let some of that out. And here I just briefly included a helpful summary of some of the skills we've talked about today, things that will be helpful in facing COVID, as it says here. This is by Russ Harris, somebody who does a lot of work in psychology about coping with difficult emotions and difficult experiences. So you can have a look at that as a way to remind you of some of the things we've talked about today. And I've also included here some links that you might find useful. There's some things here for relaxation tracks. There's some things here for different exercises that you might find useful. There's a bit there about ways you can exercise from home if you wish to. And there's a really useful website there which talks about all different activities that you can be doing at home. And there's some more here as well. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for listening today. I really hope that at least something I've said today is useful to you. And well done for anyone trying these things already. I hope they're really helpful to you. And I wish you the best of luck with everything you face in the future and with trying out some of these skills.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wickham, for your very useful tips for us all as we go into this new world post-shielding. I'm really happy to be handing over to Claire Harrison, who's going to be chairing the panel Q&A. We've had a vast number of questions, which sadly we won't be able to answer all of them right now, but we will get back to you in due course. Can I just remind you, please, that the clinicians here will not be able to answer any personalised treatment plans or comment on any blood tests. Those need to go back to your own haematology team. And over to you, Claire.
Well, thank you very much, Nona. Great job and chairing, and thank you to all the speakers. I just want to introduce a panel today, which includes most of the Guy's MPN team. So as you see us on the screen, top left is Dr. Dipti Radia, then Dr. McLaunan, then Dr. Natalia Curto Garcia, Claire Woodley, who you've already heard speaking, Abby, who gave us that fantastic talk, which I will be listening to again and practicing, and Roselle, who works alongside of Abby. And you've already met also Adam Mead, who's, I can see, is getting a nice cup of coffee, and Professor McMullen, who is in the hospital. All the rest of us, you can see, we're in our homes today. But Professor McMullen has done a ward round and is joining us on the phone. So thank you so much to everyone who has submitted questions. You will be aware that we pre-recorded, to avoid technical glitches, the presentations this morning. And you will be aware that the situation with regard to relaxing of lockdown, etc., has been changing in the last 24 to 48 hours. I think this just really illustrates the fact that you need to keep up to date. There's plenty of ability to search information on the internet. And if you're not sure, to reach to your clinical teams, but remember that we can't always give advice about your individual situation. So I'm trying to group the topics of the questions, largely because there are so many of them. We do have an hour for this panel, but it will be a challenge for us to get through all of them. So I'm going to go around the panel asking everyone in turn, and we'll try to come to some of your questions that are have been submitted this morning. If we can't, and we haven't answered them in the context of another question, we will try to send you a response. So the first question then for yourself, Dipti, is about injecting EPO. So for those of you who don't know, erythropoietin is a hormone that triggers red cell release. So the question is it possible to inject EPO into blood to help immature blood cells reach maturity?
Thanks, Claire. I guess one of the issues is that we do use EPO in situations where we can boost the bone marrow to make more red cells. It's not injected directly into the blood. It is given subcutaneously as an injection into just in the subcut tissues, and it works by boosting the bone marrow. So it's not given intravenously. And for those patients who have the marrow reserves, it will help with the anemia by boosting the bone marrow to make more red cells.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So apologies, I will mute my phone. Donal, a question for you. So your special interest is in transplantation as well as MPN. This is a question about graft versus host disease. Perhaps you could explain that to the non-transplant audience in your answer as well. The question is, if after transplant you get GVHD a year later, have you got it for life? This is from somebody who's 68 at the present time.
Thank you, Claire. So with graft versus host disease, the overall risk after transplant for myelofibrosis of all types and stages is around 30%. And that ranges from something very mild to something more severe that requires intensive immunosuppressive therapy. The graft versus host disease, we historically called it acute graft versus host disease, and that's when the immune system of the donor that's been used for the recipient reacts against the patient and can cause skin rashes, liver abnormalities, or diarrhea and nausea, most commonly within the first 3 months after transplant. After the first 3 months, any organ or system can be affected until the patient becomes tolerized to the new immune system. So graft versus disease can occur any stage after transplant. It's more uncommon to occur late without any antecedent graft versus host disease, and often it can be present for many months until the patient becomes tolerant to the GVHD.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Great answer. Natalia, there's a question here about taking hydroxycarbamide. The question is, if I take hydroxycarbamide and my platelets stay below 450, can I stop taking the medication?
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry, just testing.
Yes,
I will. So I think you should carry on taking the medication because that means your platelets are well controlled, and that's the main objective to having the medication is to prevent any complications. So my answer is yes, you should carry on. You can adjust the dose, but obviously that needs to be discussed with the team that's taking care of you.
Good. Thanks very much. I like to think about hydroxycarbamide a bit as like a blood pressure medication. If you stop taking it, your blood pressure will go back up. Claire Woodley, a question for you. This is about a patient with burning feet. The patient also mentions ringing in their ears, but let's maybe focus on burning feet in the first instance. What actions do you suggest that a patient can take to avoid having burning in their feet?
Right, so some of the kind of non-medical interventions that can be used can involve cooling the actual feet. I wouldn't recommend putting them straight into ice cold water, as this can sometimes reduce the integrity of the skin. Perhaps something like filling a plastic bottle with cold water and rolling it under the feet might help. Massaging the feet might help and improve some of the circulation down to the feet. Some patients have tried acupuncture to see if this can help. There's also the possibility of using some creams on your feet, sometimes some creams with a mild capsaicin element to them can help with reducing the sensation. And then for some patients, it's actually treating the underlying blood count.
Okay, great. So another name for that is something called erythromelalgia, isn't it? So if you read stuff online, you might see about that. So Abby and Roselle, I'm going to ask you a question together, actually. So the question really is about apps. And are there any apps that you think are helpful for, well, patients and staff or family members to use in terms of using some of these breathing techniques that you spoke to us about today, Abby, for helping with anxiety?
I think one of my favourite apps is an app called Headspace, which I do believe recently they were doing free trials. I'm not sure if that's still continuing. But there's lots and lots of different exercises on there. There's breathing exercises, there's exercises to help you let go of very difficult thoughts and emotions you might be having. And you can really get to pick if you want to do short exercises or longer ones. There's a real variety there. So I think most people that go on that app find there's something that suits them and something that helps with what they're looking for.
And I can add to that by suggesting something called ACT Companion, which takes on board some of the suggestions and ideas that were made in the presentation today. It gives you a daily reminder to be able to remember to do some of your breathing exercises, but also allows you to set some of your goals and values in line with what you feel comfortable with at the moment when you're returning back to perhaps going out a little bit more and in generally understanding your medical condition. There's also another one that's come out specifically for people from a Black and ethnic minority group that looks at some of the additional challenges that people might face when navigating through health systems or other systems as well, and that's called Liberate. These are both at the moment doing free trials, as Abby said. So I think they're doing around 3 months. So you can download it via Android or the iPhone website.
Okay, so I want to take a few questions about interferon, and particularly there is a question about, has a case been made to NICE about ROPEG? Actually, you heard John Mathias speaking about NICE and patient advocacy. There is this NICE submission at the present time underway about ROPEG interferon. There is a question about various statements about production of Pegasus ceasing as well. So I think the complete truth about that is still not clear. We have plenty of Pegasus at the present time. Whether a generic formulation of that type of interferon, which can be very effective for some patients, will be produced. Generic means that's not, it's produced, it's a bit like copies of the Dyson vacuum, if you like. So once the patent runs out on a medication, generic formulations can be produced. So that's possible, but I'm expecting that we will have ROPEG interferon being available, and that agent is being tested also in myelofibrosis, but at the present time it's only approved for PV patients. So Adam, lots of questions here about what is the data about how MPN patients might be affected by COVID? Are MPN patients more vulnerable to COVID? Are they more likely to get a clot? And I know we're gathering information on that, but I just wondered if you might want to comment on that kind of generically.
Yeah, I think the honest answer is that, that there isn't a lot of data out there at the moment. What we know about MPN is there's some recent data published showing that MPN patients, irrespective of whether they are receiving cytoreductive treatment with hydroxycarbamide or other agents or not, are at increased risk of infection. So it's reasonable to surmise that MPN patients there's a theoretical reason, at least, why they may be more at risk to develop coronavirus infection. But the reality is we don't have data, and there is a need for us to collect a lot more data here to understand the exact implications for MPN. And it's also important to remember that there are many different types of MPN, so that you can't put everything under one umbrella. It's very likely that the risks will be different. We have collected data in a reasonably comprehensive way from the big centres across the UK. I can't say much about the data yet because we're in the process of analysing it, but it's just to say that the strongest thing that seems to come out of those data is really what we already know from the normal population, that age is a strong risk factor for getting more severe complications of coronavirus.
Oh, he's been saved by the telephone from a follow-up question. Are you good to take a follow-up question, or shall I come back to you with one?
No, I've dealt with it, I think.
You're multitasking. Okay, excellent. There are quite a few questions in the chat about the difference between shielding criteria between England and Scotland, because we heard Mark, who unfortunately can't be with us today, very clearly say that in Scotland had classified myelofibrosis patients as shielded, whereas in England, the clear directive was all blood cancer patients should be shielded. So there are questions about, should ET patients be shielded, or watch and wait patients considered shielded, realising it's the 1st of August and shielding has technically been paused, but could you perhaps comment on how we interpreted that in England?
Well, what we tried to have more of a, I would say, nuanced approach in England to this, and try and categorize from our kind of best expert opinion, I would say, rather than based on strong data, who we felt were at the most risk in terms of MPN patients from the coronavirus. And my overall sense was the patients at most risk were older patients, particularly those over the age of 65, and those on medications that might lead to a stronger weakening of the immune system, in particular ruxolitinib. I suspect, having seen some of the data, patients who are younger, particularly those who are not on any treatment, are not at a markedly increased risk here. But older patients on treatment are at significant risk and should continue to take sensible precautions, whether we describe it as shielding or not. I think it's partly semantics. I think it does still pay to be cautious. I think if you have MPN, particularly if you're older or on treatment, it pays to just be cautious and pay particularly careful attention to the social distancing measures and hygiene, all the usual things.
Okay, thanks very much. So Mary Francis, a couple of questions. I can see that Werner is on the line, and he's asked, can German patients take part in Mosaic, please? So I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Not at the moment, unfortunately. We've set it up, and as you say, it's been a long period to do this in a number of UK centres, and hopefully we will have it open very, very soon. We're trying then to get other centres. The Republic of Ireland are looking to set up a centre, and there may well be further ones. Again, we've looked for funding and various things in Australia and the US, but it basically needs somebody in the country to get funding to do it. We would be very happy if to get other centres in, but they need to have funding in order to come into the system and collect and do all the regulation, etc., in the country.
Okay, so get the money and you're welcome.
Yeah.
It's the message, yeah. Okay,
Yes.
and then the question that I just told you I was going to ask you. What is the longest time that hydroxycarbamide is known to control MPN?
Right, an easy question, that one. So I don't think there's an answer to that. I've been a consultant now almost for 30 years, which is horrifying. And there are certainly patients that I inherited who were on hydroxycarbamide and continue on hydroxycarbamide. So many, many, many years. Obviously, the disease can progress. It may not control as well as time goes on. But I have certainly patients who live their normal lifespan on hydroxycarbamide, but I couldn't give you an exact answer.
Okay, and then just lastly, there's one about allele burden.
Yes.
Why aren't we tested for it, and can it be checked later?
So it certainly can be checked later. It to some extent is still a research test. It's not really a routine test. And again, the point about why aren't we testing at the beginning, it depends on when people came along and at what point. It's been done mostly in trials to follow the allele burden, because you're trying a new drug, you're very interested to see will the allele burden decrease over time. And I think it will come in more into routine practice. But the problem is that most of the people, their allele burden is probably not going to change greatly over time. What you would like to see is a drug where the allele burden goes down or dissipate, or the mutant disappears. But most of the time that is not the case. But I'm sure Adam and people are doing this more and more as part of following people in a research context.
Okay, Adam, did you want to comment on that? Yeah.
Well, I would just say I think there's probably some regional variation, because our laboratory does routinely report the allele burden in our results. So we do routinely monitor this in the lab, particularly, as you say, for patients treated with interferon. We not infrequently see the allele burden coming down, and I think it is a useful measure. It can also have important implications in terms of understanding the natural history of the disease. So I trust to have that reported locally, and we do now report this routinely.
Okay, great, thanks. So Dipti, you gave a beautiful presentation on management and measuring symptoms in MPN at the American Society meeting a year or so back. Could you just kind of talk through some strategies for managing itch, which can be very difficult for patients, please?
Thanks very much, Claire. I think we have to acknowledge that none of us actually, unless we've got that symptom, how terrible itching can be. And there are lots of pharmacological ways, but non-pharmacological ways, I think there are several, and that's been reported by patients. So most commonly, there is the aquagenic itch, where patients step into a shower, they have touched with water, and they find they're extremely itchy. And I think there was some basic stuff that we've learned from patients in the fact that everyone has their own temperature gauge. So practicalities are find a temperature that's appropriate for you when you have your shower. Don't sit in a hot tub for too long. Change the shower head pressure is what patients have reported back, so it's gentle, because what you're doing is you're activating some mast cells in your skin which cause the itching, so that way you're being gentler with them. The other things that have been recommended is when you come out of your shower, dab rather than rub the towels, because they make the itching worse. One of the most common things is actually just dry skin, regardless of whether you have PV or not, causes itching. And if you go to any dermatologist, they're just going to say moisturize, moisturize, moisturize. And I think just general moisturization of your skin, keeping it cool, using non-fragrant lotions has been recommended. Some people find calamine can help if they're getting very, very itchy. Dressing in cotton and light clothes, loose fitting clothes. Again, if you're active and you go to the gym and you're wearing tight clothes, that sweat comes into contact with your skin. So cotton clothes will help. And I guess the other thing is if you're, once the itch starts, patients complain about the fact that they'll scratch and then the itch will spread like wildfire. And it was interesting listening to Abby talking about breathing exercises. A few folk have found that actually using a cold flannel and then using breathing exercises just to try and get on top of that itch to stop you from scratching it, making it spread around your body is very good. And one patient has told me nail care, not having long nails. I know it sounds ridiculous, but having really short nails that are filed. So once you start scratching, you're not actually making that worse. And then there's a whole lot of antihistamines and other medical stuff. But sometimes if it works well. But actually just some of the practicalities that have been shared by patients.
Okay, that's great. And then there is just one more question that's come in online about cough. I think they noticed in Leslie's talk and your talk, Mary Frances, about cough being a symptom of MPN. So would you just mind commenting on that? Whether you think that cough is a common symptom?
It's not a particularly common symptom. I think it can reflect the fact that your spleen's got bigger and sometimes your diaphragm can be irritated and that can cause cough. And I think that's one of the ways people can present, unless anyone else has got others. I think it's not a very common symptom, but it is if your spleen's very big.
Okay, that's absolutely great. So
Thank
you very much. Donal, a question for you then. I know you're leading a study on ruxolitinib and COVID, so could you just comment on the utility of ruxolitinib in COVID? And then a follow-up question about what the implication is then for patients with MPN who might be on Rux.
Yeah, so thank you. So I think that you've already highlighted in your question two important aspects of ruxolitinib. So we at Guy's and other centres across the UK and also in Italian centres and previously in China have looked or are planning to look at the use of ruxolitinib as an immunosuppressive agent to down-regulate the immune disarray that can happen as a response to COVID. And we know that in the population, that when patients have COVID who have a severe response to the virus, they get disarray of their immune system. And because the immune system is uncontrolled, it can lead to damage to the lungs, to the vascular system and other organs. And what we're planning to look at in Guy's and St Thomas's is the use of ruxolitinib for patients who have unfortunately contracted COVID and have a severe illness and are prior to going to intensive care. So their markers of inflammation are high, their breathing requirements are under stress, and their oxygen levels are falling. And in those particular patients, we're planning to use ruxolitinib to try to bring the immune system and harness the immune system under control. And what we're trying to do with the trial is to prevent patients having to go to intensive care and be ventilated. Some early data from the Italian and Chinese group in around 20 patients have shown some early signs of efficacy, but of course we have to balance that against too much immune suppression and then uncontrolled viral replication. So to answer Claire's second question, which is what does that mean for us for MPN patients who are already on ruxolitinib? We know that across the board for ruxolitinib, it is an immunosuppressive. So if we think about the front army of immune response called T and B cells, we and others have shown that ruxolitinib suppresses those cells. We also know that in the background, so the second line of defense called the innate immune system, it can also have immunosuppressive effects. And that's why when we look at the shielding guidance for patients, we talk particularly about patients who are on immunosuppressive. If you're on an immunosuppressive agent of any type and you're unfortunate enough to contract COVID-19, it may mean that the early immune response to try to keep the virus under control is attenuated. So it's balancing the effects of the immunosuppression at the time of the viral illness.
Okay, so do you think that patients should avoid starting ruxolitinib or lower their dose?
So I think there should be no changes that we've been advising the whole way through since the start of the pandemic in dose alteration of ruxolitinib based solely on COVID-19. The problem with stopping abruptly dose reducing ruxolitinib irrespective if there was COVID on board or not, would be releasing the brake on inflammation, and there'd be a marked rebound in inflammatory molecules, and actually the inflammatory cascade could become under control. I wouldn't abrogate, consider dose attenuation of ruxolitinib. I think we do have to consider commencement of any immune suppressive drug during the COVID-19 era. Clearly, for patients who have an indication as regards either spleen or symptoms for starting ruxolitinib, then I would advocate commencement of the drug as long as there's a clear clinical need.
Okay, that's really clear. Thank you very much. Natalia, there is a question about the difference between primary and secondary forms of disease. So I'm just wondering if you could just, and this is quite complicated, isn't it? So maybe just, if you could just give an answer focusing on that, first of all for myelofibrosis, and then I will probably follow up and ask you again also about high hemoglobin, but let's ask about MF first.
Yeah, so in terms of MF, you have the primary myelofibrosis, which means it's like a new disease. When you have a fibrotic tissue, you have maybe a high spleen, anemia, some change on the your peripheral blood and the bone marrow. And the secondary myelofibrosis is those cases that come from a previous PV or ET patient, so previous polycythemia or essential thrombocythemia, and the patients progress to the most advanced stage, and they present with these changes on the bone marrow, so more scar tissue, fibrotic tissue. They may develop a big large spleen. They may develop anemia or other complications. So that's the main kind of distinctions. In terms of how we treat the patients is pretty similar for us in terms of your primary or secondary, and there's different markers that we use to decide do we need to start treatment or not. In terms of complication, again, it's quite similar. We probably, in terms of molecular, we're probably doing kind of similar investigations. Sometimes you need to be maybe looking further if there's any new mutations when there's a progression from a PV and ET.
Okay, that's great. And just could you just briefly just highlight the difference between primary and secondary polycythemia or erythrocytosis?
Yeah, so in the case of the primary erythrocytosis or polycythemia, you have molecular markers like the JAK2 mutation, which is the most common one. Secondary erythrocytosis will be caused by different other diseases that are not primary hematological, such as lung problems or kidney problems. Some patients, even we don't have a clear underlying reason why they have a high red cells, and we call idiopathic erythrocytosis. Now we have the capacity to, or we've been developing new techniques, and we have investigated for other gene mutations that could be associated with erythrocytosis, for instance, on your erythropoietin receptor or other diseases that are related with family members that have a gene mutation. That so it's a big difference, and the patients are managed in obviously different way. Some patients with secondary erythrocytosis, we need to do venesection to them, but our targets are higher than in patients with polycythemia vera, and they normally don't require any other treatments at all.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Claire Woodley, there's a couple of questions that have come up about turmeric and curcumin. Could you just give us your kind of a pragmatic view of kind of how you would address a question about that and what's known about efficacy of that kind of therapy?
So we know that both curcumin and turmeric have been explored with other cancers. Their investigations for their use in kind of MPNs hasn't been widely explored. There was a study that looked at the effect of curcumin on the JAK2 in cells and the JAK2 signaling pathways. What we do know about them, though, is that they're both anti-inflammatory, or their anti-inflammatory properties. So considering that we know there is an inflammatory process with MPNs, they could be used in that way. I think the important thing is that if patients are considering trialing either of these, is that they discuss it with their treating team because they can interact with some other medications that patients are taking.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. Mary Frances, there's a few questions here about interferon. Firstly, is there any evidence that interferon can slow progression or stop progression of disease, especially if the interferon is started at diagnosis?
I don't know whether we have any evidence to suggest that yet. Certainly with some of the interferons, you see a reduction in the size of the clone, and certainly in theory, if you could eliminate the clone, would you get rid of the disease? So there is an argument that it's the agent that will decrease the clone size, and that may be effective in slowing progression. I think what this question is asking is, should it be started up front, or should you wait until patients come into a high risk group with an indication for starting treatment? And I don't think there's enough evidence yet to say that if you started earlier, you can prevent progression. But that may change over time.
What did you think about Professor Barboui's study then that Donal showed us as an update from EHA with regard to using ROPEG interferon and venesection compared to venesection alone? What would you hope to see? This is in low risk PV. What would you hope to see from that study?
Well, obviously that is the issue, that if you see on the interferon a lack of decrease of clone size and possibly decreased progression, that would be very effective. But that's going to take a very long time before you will actually see that.
Okay, and lastly, are there patients who are resistant to interferon? And sorry, you're getting all the interferon questions. I just grouped them all together. And how common is it?
So there are two issues with interferon, and the major one would be intolerance. Quite a lot of patients cannot tolerate the interferon, but resistance is a different issue. Are there patients who do not get any effective reduction in their cell counts first with interferon? There certainly are, because I've seen some. I can think of immediately at least one patient in the MAGIC trial who got no response whatsoever to, in the interferon trial, who got no response whatsoever to interferon. So there are patients who are resistant. I think they're probably quite rare. I don't have a good feel for what numbers, but there aren't many. And I think you do have to keep trying with the interferon, starting with a very low dose and then building the dose up before you arrive at that conclusion. I don't know whether others think it's more common, but it does happen.
Anybody else want to comment? I'm wondering about just leapfrogging over myself and Adam and bringing in Roselle and Abby, because one of the common issues with interferon actually is low mood. And yeah, I think you've worked with some of our patients who've had low mood, sometimes before interferon. Sometimes we ask you to see patients before and sometimes during. And I just wondered if you might want to make a few comments about that, maybe. I don't know who wants to speak. Both of you, maybe. Roselle, could you comment on managing low mood as a consequence of interferon?
Yes, as you said, Claire, it's something that we receive a lot of referrals about for people that either have already had experiences over their lifetime of low mood, or people that are experiencing low mood and sometimes mixed emotions, sometimes a little bit more anxiety or perhaps anger as a result of the medication. Some people make the choices with the medical team to change the medication, and other people will work with us closely to be able to develop some techniques and ideas around how to manage some of those feelings. Very much it's similar to Abby's presentation. Lots of the techniques within that are really useful for all types of emotions and feelings, regardless of the pandemic. So in terms of, firstly, really feeling like it's normal to be able to feel mixed emotions and confusion when you are starting on new medications and treatment, that can be really anxiety provoking. And also having lots of changes in how you're perhaps working throughout the day. So being able to use some of those techniques, breathing exercises, acknowledging some of your feelings and knowing it's okay to have mixed emotions and that there's nothing wrong with you, that you're not mad or going mad in any way, that it's sometimes a normal reaction to the feelings of medication. If you do have a psychologist within your team, you can reach out and talk to them. But as mentioned in the previous question that we had, there are lots of online resources around ways of managing low mood or mixed feelings without necessarily needing an additional medication. Do you want to add anything to that, Abby?
Not really. I think I would definitely echo what you said, Roselle, about remembering that feeling all sorts of emotions at that point is really normal. And I think a lot of the clients that I've worked with, sometimes what makes it even harder is what you think having those feelings mean and the distress that comes from feeling that way in the first place. So I think the first thing definitely is to remind yourself that that's okay, and there's lots of things you can do to manage some of those emotions.
Okay. I think that's really helpful, and just reflecting that you can get those emotions anyway in response to a diagnosis or a traumatic event, but interferon can definitely heighten them. And yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks. Adam, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm sorry to keep asking you COVID questions, but I will ask you some disease questions shortly. But just really pertinent to your presentation, two common themes are coming up. One theme is vaccine. Will MPN patients be able to get one? Will they be prioritised for it? And you mentioned that the Oxford vaccine was a live vaccine. Is that a problem? And then a comment, please, on coagulation and the interface between coagulation problems, COVID and MPN.
Okay,
You touched on all of these.
I'll take the vaccines first. And the first thing to say about the whole vaccine story in coronavirus is the progress is just utterly remarkable. A process that normally takes many years is happening over weeks and months. And there are over 160 vaccines in development, but there are some lead candidates, one of them being the vaccine from Oxford. Now that is an inactivated, what's called adenovirus, which is a vaccine backbone, you would describe it as, which is derived from a chimpanzee virus. So it's a live inactivated virus. Whether one can use those viruses in MPN patients, I suspect one would need to do a study just to test the safety of that. In fact, I was in discussion with the exact same team that is developing this vaccine about using the exact same vaccine backbone to develop a vaccine approach in MPN. So the direct answer to the question is it going to be possible to use in MPN patients? I think yes, but it's going to be subject to having to collect some safety data relating to that. The other thing to say about that is that it's not the only kid on the block, as it were. There are the so-called mRNA vaccines. One of them, the Moderna vaccine, is kind of quite close behind the Oxford vaccine, and that is not a live vaccine. So even if there were safety concerns and issues relating to the Oxford vaccine approach, that there are likely to be other candidates coming through, and the data looks very encouraging in terms of these vaccines inducing a strong immune response, both the Moderna and the Oxford vaccine. I should say I am not a vaccine expert. I'm just following the literature very, very closely. So we could get a vaccine expert onto one of these panels to give you more comments. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on the the live attenuated adeno approach. I certainly think it would be possible to use that in MPN, but I think it would need to be tested and collect some safety data in a pilot study first.
I mean, I think we just have to just think a bit. So, you know, I mean, I think, first of all, these are all going very quickly, aren't they? And generally at the moment, the vaccine is being focused on sort of healthcare workers who are going to come into contact with COVID and have excluded people with illness. I know because I'm a participant on the study and I just squeaked in. I was just kind of hoping on their grounds of age, etc. So, but I think that really it's only live attenuated vaccines that we think would be a problem for MPN patients. We couldn't see that there would be a problem with other ones.
Potentially a problem, right? I mean, I'm not aware personally of any data that these types of vaccines have been a problem in MPN. So it's a theoretical problem. And I think in that situation, one has to balance the risks and benefits. And I think clearly, if the Oxford vaccine comes through and shows really good efficacy in the big clinical trial, you know, I think there would be quite a strong incentive if the other vaccines were not, you know, were substantially far behind the Oxford vaccine. There would be quite a strong rationale for testing that in MPN, I would argue.
I think as well, we all have to weigh up risk and benefit, don't we? I think there's another clear message here is, you know, please get your flu vaccine this year. When you get offered a flu vaccine, please get the flu vaccine. The NHS will be having a massive push on that. There was a question about a flu study that was done at Guy's, and we'll update you on that at some point. We've just submitted it for publication, and that looks at the way that the immune system responds in MPN patients to flu. And maybe Donald, do you want to comment on that, the flu vaccine and the MPN?
Sure. So this is work that many of us on the call and others were involved in Guy's, really looking to see how patients with an MPN, how their immune system responded to the annual influenza A vaccine compared to individuals who didn't have an MPN. So what we've learned from that in brief is that the immune response can be slightly less so for those patients with underlying MPN compared to others, but there is an immune response. And that's the most important thing, that although it may not be as robust an immune response as individuals who do not have an MPN, but an immune response, and it's built on each year that all of us receive the vaccine. Just to finally comment on influenza vaccines and COVID, I saw one question that was asked, does influenza vaccine give any degree of protection against COVID-19? So the two viruses are completely different. So the way the vaccines are designed, the answer would be a no. The neutralizing antibodies and the initial immune response COVID-19. However, when they've looked at almost 90,000 Brazilian patients and split the groups based on those Brazilian patients, because their flu season is earlier, it's April and May, those patients who had been challenged with a vaccine actually had a less severe course with COVID-19. And that's not because the vaccine itself stimulates the immune response to COVID, but it backs up the immune system. This means the immune system is more alert and reactive. And when challenged with COVID, certainly in younger and older individuals, the disease course with COVID was much less. So that again gives us a very strong rationale for all of us to have the influenza.
Okay, great. So back to you, Adam, just to comment on clotting. I said I would ask you about that. Yeah.
Just to very briefly finish off on the vaccine, because the other issue that you asked me about was whether MPN patients would be prioritized. Again,
yes.
You know, these kind of decisions are going to be made at an extremely high level and not by me. But I suspect there will be targeted vaccination going to the high risk groups when a vaccine becomes available. And I would imagine MPN patients would fall into that category as they've been advised to shield. But again, you know, we have to wait and see what vaccine comes through and what the government guidance is on the clotting and vascular problems. I mean, clearly it has emerged from many different studies now that at the heart of the really severe end of the spectrum of coronavirus disease is what's called a vascular injury, where you get this severe inflammation, which can be in the lung, but it can affect other tissues such as the kidneys, the heart, the brain. And it's a complex interaction between the inflammation driven by the virus and the blood vessel walls and the clotting system. And that can drive all sorts of problems with actually getting blood clots, and which themselves cause damage kind of indirectly as a result of the virus. So that's very clear. There is, I would say, circumstantial evidence that if you more strongly anticoagulate or thin the blood of patients with severe disease, it does protect against worse outcomes. But that is not what I would say the kind of gold standard type of evidence, which is randomized controlled trial data. Those studies are now being done in the UK and elsewhere. So we will get an answer about the role of blood thinners in the management of the disease. Specifically relating to MPN, I go back to my previous answer. I'm afraid we don't yet have enough data, certainly no data to suggest that MPN patients are at increased risk. You could argue that MPN patients should already have optimal control of their blood thinning and vascular risk factors, which may well be, you know, to a certain benefit that most patients will either be on aspirin or some form of blood thinner in advance. I don't think there's any suggestion or evidence at the moment that any of those medications should change. There was some debate about aspirin early on, but there's no evidence that there's any problematic role for aspirin relating to coronavirus. So those medications should not change, and everyone should continue them as recommended.
Yeah, and remember that we treat you to reduce generally the risk of clotting, so ideally should be optimised. And obviously, now we can start monitoring patients again more closely. This will be fine. I saw a question online about will I ever be able to have a face-to-face appointment at Guy's Hospital? So I think we can answer the question yes. We actually, Rosella and Abby, you've been using Attend Anywhere, which is a kind of video appointment app, isn't it? So I don't know whether you want to comment on that and how you found that.
We've had lots of questions around when people are going to be coming back to the hospital, and that goes similarly for when people are going anywhere really, back to work or back to other environments. The hospitals are all working very hard to make sure that the hospitals are COVID secure and safe, which allows for social distancing. We've also had some really good feedback so far on virtual platforms like this, where people have found it really helpful to be able to not have to travel long distances or commute, or necessarily have to get fully dressed to be able to then attend their appointment. So we found for lots of people, they've really valued being able to have either psychology sessions or contacts online. And the systems, we were a little bit worried about them being quite complicated, but actually you get given a text message reminder appointment in the same way that you would your usual appointment. And there's a link. You don't need to download anything. It comes up on your usual Internet Explorer page, enters you into a waiting room, and then you can enter and join with either one clinician or multiple clinicians, so you don't miss out on seeing different people as if you were to come to the hospital. So we found it really good so far and really accessible for most people. But of course, we like to be able to see people. We like to be able to have those familiar informal contacts in the corridors and say hello to people when they're in the waiting room. So we do definitely look forward to people coming back and seeing both us and all of your medical teams when it feels safe to.
Yeah, and we can see some patients face to face. We are working very hard to keep the environment as safe as possible. Probably we won't ever go back to, hopefully never, go back to the massively overcrowded waiting room with people standing in the corridor waiting to be seen. We never liked that in the first place. But we definitely are. And if you do want to come to Guy's, there's a lovely video on the webpage from our chief nurse and infection control lead about how safe the hospital is. So Dipti, I'm going to come to you now with a couple of questions that have come up about hydroxycarbamide, actually. Something about long-term complications, and something about links between migraines and platelets and hydroxyurea.
Okay, thank you, Claire. So as Mary had said, hydroxycarbamide you can use for a long, long time if you're stable, and we've had patients on it for more than 15, 20 years or so. I guess the long-term effects, one of the commonest side effects of hydroxycarbamide affect the gut in some way, initially with nausea, vomiting, bowel changes and constipation. And they can continue for a while if patients have them and they're reasonably well managed. The way hydroxycarbamide works is by affecting the DNA in repair in the cells. And so long term, very long term, one of the concerns is about making sure you look after your skin. There's an association with skin lesions, either benign or some skin cancers. So the advice is, if you are on it, make sure that you are using sunscreen, make sure that you're actually taking care of your skin and being aware of it. So if you do see or notice any lesions, you let your clinician or your GP know so that they can be looked at. And that's, skin lesions and skin cancers are common anyway, but there's a link with hydroxycarbamide long term for that. Skin changes, which usually happen in people with slightly darker skin, so you can get changes in skin discoloration and nail discoloration, and that affects people in different ways to different degrees. And then I guess fatigue is associated with it, but then fatigue is a very complex symptom to try and manage, so it may not all be hydroxycarbamide. And then I guess the long-term biggest question is about whether or not there's an increased risk of leukemia with hydroxycarbamide. And I guess what I would say for that is there were some studies done by the French group about almost 8 years ago now, and the broad outlines for those were those patients that had hydroxycarbamide with PV, it was done with PV patients and had venesections. There wasn't an increased risk between those groups, it was hydroxycarbamide alone. But if patients had hydroxycarbamide and another drug, another alkylating agent like busulfan to control their platelet counts, they had a slightly higher risk of having progressing onto something called myelodysplastic syndrome or leukemia. We know from our studies from patients with sickle cell disease there isn't an increased risk of leukemia, but we have to bear in mind that patients with MPN have an underlying problem with the bone marrow in terms of mutations, so that's what increases the risk. I think those are the long-term, main two long-term risks that I can think of, unless I've missed something from my colleagues.
No, that was great. And then just briefly, could you comment about migraines and platelets before we move on to ask the last couple of questions?
There was one about, I think there was one about migraines, platelets and hydroxycarbamide. I'm not sure there are two different things. If you have high platelets, then you get microvascular symptoms. We know there's definite an association between having a higher platelet count and people suffering from migraines because they get it's part of the microvascular symptoms. Whether hydroxycarbamide, it causes headaches, but I don't think there's a direct association with migraines. I think it's the fact that you have higher platelets. Once the platelets are managed with hydroxycarbamide or any cytoreductive therapy, patients' migraines seem to get better. You might get, one of the other things is you might get platelet cycling. Some patients have platelets that are quite high, so it takes a while for the hydroxycarbamide to control their platelet count. And it may be that's what's causing or consistently leading to the migraines being there.
Cool. So she asked a question for Donal. Upper age of transplantation. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so that's quite clear for us across Europe. Most of us within the field of MPN and transplant would consider allograft up to the age of 70 years if the patient had no major significant comorbidities and had an eligible donor.
Okay, great. You were more succinct than I was expecting then. And then just about CALR mutations. Can you just talk to us about different types of CALR mutations? And then just a last question to Claire Woodley then after that.
Sure. So there were two major publications in 2013 looking at the incidence and relevance of CALR mutations in MPN. So that's really around 1 in 4 patients with myelofibrosis or ET have one of the CALR mutations. There are around 50 different calreticulin mutations or more that have now been reported, but the vast majority of patients have type 1 or type 2. And you'd also see some reports that say type 1-like or type 2-like. Calreticulin has multiple functions within the cell, but indirectly the mutations will lead to upregulation of JAK-STAT signaling. So the differences are, compared to JAK2 mutations, often patients are younger, they often have a higher platelet count, a lower white cell count, and the initial studies suggested a lower risk of thrombosis, but actually on reflection, that most likely reflects the younger age of individuals with calreticulin. And for myelofibrosis, if we think, or for ET, for CALR type 1 and type 2, often type 2 has a higher platelet count than type 1. There can be different mutations that are non-driving mutations in the background, differing between type 2 and type 1. And those would be the major differences between type 2 and type 1 calreticulin mutations.
So it's probably important, is it, to know which type of CALR mutation you have if you're a patient with one of them?
I think it is important. I think we certainly in our centre will type the CALR mutation. I think we're learning more about calreticulin. We know that on some therapies, as other panel members have discussed today, there can be, it's not as sensitive to interferon as JAK2, but you can see changes in the percentage of calreticulin mutation. So I think as we move forward with more appropriate stratification and molecular stratification of patients, it would be important to know the type of calreticulin mutation that has been assigned within the lab.
Okay, that's great. And then Claire Woodley, you get the last question. Just about measuring symptoms, because that's so important. It's a massive impact on quality of life, important in terms of measuring benefit of treatments, etc. Just can you just comment on how you recommend measurement of symptoms? And there is a question about MPN app as well.
Yeah, so within our centre we use the MPN 10 symptom assessment form. So this is a form which helps patients to grade their 10 most common symptoms that we find are relevant to these conditions, and they get to grade them on a score of 1 to 10, or 0 to 10, sorry, 0 being non-existent to 10 being the worst for them over the last 24 hours. Now this is a very individualised score. But what it helps us to do is to track over time how their scores are changing. It also is helpful for the patient because sometimes it can be when you come into a consult, it can help you focus with the clinician on what is most important for you. And as you said, it can help with tracking the impact of treatments onto how your symptoms are responding to the treatments. There, as you mentioned, there is an app. It's called the MPN Assistant UK, and it's an app where you can download onto both iPhones and Android phones, and it helps you. It has the MPN 10 form on there, and you can score your symptoms quite easily as a scroll through on the app. It can then be emailed to your clinical nurse specialist or to your treating team so that they can have that ahead of your clinic appointment if you wish, and can be able to discuss it with you then in your appointment. On the app you can also make notes of your blood results, which can be important if you end up in a different hospital, because you can have that information with you. When you download the app, it will only work on the device that you download the app to. So if you have it on your iPhone, it won't then transfer to your iPad. It is only on the one device that you download to.
Okay, that's absolutely fantastic. And I can't believe an hour's gone by already. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to hand back to Nona. We gave you a break. We didn't ask you any questions. I didn't think you wanted any. So I'm going to hand over to you to close now, Nona. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. And on behalf of MPN Voice, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all the clinicians who have given up a Saturday morning to give us some amazing insights and information to living with an MPN. I'd also like to thank Andriana and the team at Brancast Health who've been helping us with all the technical side, and endless patience with a technophobe like me. Thank you. And just one other thing to remember, that on the 10th of September, it's the MPN Awareness Day. please keep an eye on the website to see the plans we have to raise the profile of MPNs. Finally, thank you all, and thank you all of you listening and taking part. We look forward to the next online forum, whenever that's going to be possible. And the main thing is stay well and keep safe. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.